Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're meandering through the hazy halls of history to explore something wonderfully odd and often overlooked, what getting a bit tipsy, or entirely wasted, was like in medieval times. This isn't the wild party history you might expect. Instead, think slow-sipped ale from wooden cups, sleepy taverns lit by flickering tallow candles, and peculiar drinking customs that somehow managed to mix religion, superstition, and bad hygiene in equal measure. We'll wander through old feasts, fermented failures, and ale-soaked misunderstandings, all at a pace as gentle as a lazy tavern dog curled up by the fire. If these quiet, curious corners of the past help you relax or unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings a little peace to your evening. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy seeing the sleepy little constellation we make together across the world. So now's a good time to dim the lights. Maybe settle into a cozy spot. Let the hum of a fan or a night breeze drift through the room, and let yourself ease into the stillness. And with that, let's begin our gentle journey into the ale-drenched lullabies of the medieval world. When we think of the Anglo-Saxons, we often picture grim warriors with dull axes and thick beards, perhaps standing on the edge of some foggy battlefield. But to understand these early medieval peoples, truly understand them, you have to go where they really lived. The mead hall, not the battlefield, not the village church, but the long, smoky, timber-lined communal hall where drink flowed freely and social hierarchy fermented alongside barrels of fermented honey. If there was a beating heart of Anglo-Saxon life, it wasn't in the quiet scriptorium or even the war campet pulsed inside the mug, sloshed about in the horn, and reverberated through the thudding songs of half-sober bards. Mead, the signature drink of this era, was more than a sugary way to get warm in winter. It was an institution, brewed from honey, water, and occasionally spiced with herbs. The Anglo-Saxon mead was not refined, wasn't meant to be. It was strong, sometimes dangerously so, and typically brewed in batches by the women of the household or, in wealthier communities, by enslaved workers or monks. There were no purity laws, no quality controls, and certainly no polite sipping. A strong batch might blur the line between sacred and social mead, was offered to the gods, to guests, and to the warband. After a good raid, in fact, refusing a drink could be interpreted as either insult or illness. The architecture of the mead hall itself reflected this centrality of drink. These were not modest huts. They were intentionally imposing, long, narrow communal spaces, with raised thrones at one end for the lord and benches down the sides for warriors and guests. The hearth, often in the middle, did more than keep things warm. It provided light, status, and smoke for flavor. Drinking was not a private act, but a public, political, and cultural performance. One did not simply drink, one boasted, one recited, one swore oaths over the cup, made claims about their dead father's courage, or their intention to kill a rival before the next moon. The drink loosened tongues and tightened bonds. At feasts, the cupbearer, usually a woman of noble birth, a subtle but crucial role. She moved among the warriors, offering the communal cup or horn, reinforcing status by who drank first, who drank last, and who was skipped. Each drink was a moment of ritual, not mere refreshment. An ill-timed offering or a poorly observed toast could unravel the delicate web of alliances and honor. She didn't just carry the cup, she controlled the rhythm of the night. Despite the boisterous atmosphere, drunkenness was not entirely without limits. The Anglo-Saxons had no word for moderation, but they did have plenty of advice, most of it in poetry, about the dangers of excessive drinking. The famous poem Maxims, "I warned that ale is another thing. It often makes men forget wisdom." In other words, drink was encouraged, right up until it wasn't. Those who couldn't handle their mead often found themselves mocked in verse or ignored by the Lord entirely. Honor mattered more than indulgence. Drinking was not just about pleasure, it was a political act. When a warrior pledged his loyalty to a king or lord, it was done with a cup in hand. When new alliances were forged between families or tribes, the mead flowed. If someone had to be forgiven or flattered, that too happened in the hall. The more generous the lord with his drink, the stronger his grip on his people's loyalty. A stingy chieftain was no chieftain at all. Mead made men loyal, but it also made them loud, and that noise filled the sagas that would later be written down by quieter, more sober monks. But what did mead really taste like? Was it sweet and perfumed, or bitter and herbal? And who exactly brewed it in those early centuries? What were their methods, their rituals, their failures? Could a bad batch ruin a feast or worse, a king's reputation? If Section 1 brought us into the mead hall, smoky and loud, where warriors shouted oaths and boasted about things half remembered and half true, then Section 2 draws us into the quieter, steamier spaces behind the hall, the outbuildings and earth-floored brewing rooms, where the drink was actually made, because the clink of drinking horns may have echoed through Anglo-Saxon society. But it was the hands of women, particularly those of the household, that set the rhythm in the first place. Anglo-Saxon mead didn't come from the divine, it came from labor. Brewing was not some mystical art, but a part of the routine duties of many women, especially those in wealthier or better supplied homes. We don't often think of female brewers when picturing early medieval societies, but they were absolutely central. The very act of brewing a careful balance of water, honey, thyme, and temperature was considered a type of domestic magic, not spiritual, perhaps, but certainly social. It kept men loyal, guests impressed, and trade goods moving. Honey, of course, was the centerpiece of this process, and bees were highly prized. Anglo-Saxon beekeeping was more sophisticated than one might guess. Hives were often kept in woven, skepsop-turned basket-like structures and were monitored not just for yield but for behavior. Honey was used sparingly in food but liberally in drink. In fact, mead brewing often relied on what was known as honey water, a residue left after combs were pressed or honey extracted. Nothing was wasted, but everything depended on care. Too much fermentation time, and you'd end up with vinegar. Too little, and you'd get a drink that was weak, sickly sweet, and socially embarrassing. There was no such thing as yeast packets or thermometers. Brewers relied on open-air fermentation and seasonal cues, the natural yeasts in the environment, and sometimes leftover dregs from previous batches kick-started the process. Temperatures were judged by hand, experience, and the smell of the brewing pot. Herbs like meadowsweet, rosemary, and sometimes even hops were used not only for flavor, but to preserve the brew and ward off spoilage. This was long before germ theory, of course, but even then, people could taste when something had gone off, and it wasn't just mead. Ale made from fermented grains was far more common for daily consumption. Mead was expensive, honey was precious, ale was the real workhorse of the Anglo-Saxon liquid diet. Children drank it, the sick were prescribed it, and travelers relied on it when water sources were unsafe, which, frankly, was most of the time. Brewing ale, like mead, was a woman's task, and it was deeply embedded in both ritual and routine. Bad ale meant angry husbands and dissatisfied guests. Good ale, it could elevate a household's reputation. Interestingly, the very act of brewing could also confer authority. Some households became known for their skill with fermentation, and women who mastered the craft could trade, barter, and earn quiet influence in a world officially ruled by men. Brewing knowledge passed down generationally, mother to daughter, often orally with no written recipe. It was one of the few areas where female control went largely unchallenged, and yet their names don't appear in the charters or the chronicles. You will not read about Ealhswith's exceptional elderflower mead or Wulfwin's barley ale that once saved a feast, but those drinks were there, bubbling just off stage. Of course, the process was not without its dangers. Brewing equipment had to be watched constantly. If the honey water boiled over or the grain stew curdled, the batch was ruined. Fires had to be managed with precision. Accidents were common, especially when boiling large quantities in stone or clay vessels over open hearths. A spilled brew wasn't just a disappointment, it was a loss of labor, prestige, and potentially social standing. And unlike today's pubs, where a ruined keg can be written off, a bad batch in the mead hall era could spark arguments, insults, or, in more violent households, fists. So, how did this homemade, woman-crafted drink scale up to serve whole communities? That's where institutions like monasteries and royal estates came in. With more labor, more land, and more storage space, monasteries in particular began to dominate large-scale brewing. Monks kept bees, cultivated herbs, and documented brewing methods with far more consistency than oral household traditions. Their bruises, especially meads, and urban-fused ales became known across regions. And unlike the homebrew of villages, which changed with every batch, monastic brewing leaned into consistency, which made it valuable for trade. This shift slowly began to change the social landscape of drinking. As production moved from the domestic to the monastic and the commercial, brewing, once the domain of women, began its long march into male hands. By the Norman conquest, brewing guilds and legal restrictions would start to appear, often excluding women or making it financially unviable for them to compete. But in the Anglo-Saxon centuries, the brewmistress reigned. Still, no matter where it was brewed or who made it, what mattered most was how the drink functioned once it entered the cup. Mead and ale weren't just foodstuffs or indulgences, were cultural tools. You toasted alliances, you marked seasons, you mourned the dead, and you vowed vengeance over the cup. Every sip in a mead hall reinforced the unspoken codes of loyalty, bravery, generosity, and, crucially, memory. To be drunk was to remember to be fully part of the group, bound by stories and drink and promises. But not every gathering was sacred. What happened when drink went too far? What happened when the mead gave rise not to memory, but to violence? What of the moments when drunkenness stopped being ritual and started being danger? We've seen how Anglo-Saxon drinking was a social glue, a ritual, a way of structuring loyalty, memory, and hierarchy. But what happens when too much mead unglued those very things? Because while the mead hall could be a place of celebration and status, it could just as easily turn into a site of chaos where drunken warriors misjudged the limits of honor, and a cup too many became the difference between brotherhood and bloodshed. Anglo-Saxon literature is full of warnings about drink gone wrong. Beowulf, that grand old poem every medievalist cuts their teeth on, doesn't just sing of battles and monsters, it also warns us, subtly, about the dangers of arrogance, especially the kind fueled by too much mead. The mead hall in Beowulf isn't just a backdrop, it's a crucible for identity and tension. Before battles, the warriors drink. Before boasts, there is always mead. But behind the boasting lies risk, the wrong word at the wrong time, uttered by a half-drunken warrior, could invite insult, challenge, even violence. Drinking was a test of restraint as much as camaraderie, and not everyone passed that test. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, while often more interested in battles and kings, does occasionally hint at disorder born from feasting and excess. There are subtle references to gatherings that turned sour, alliances that unraveled, and friendships that ended in knife wounds, all made possible by the drink that supposedly bound men together. In one case, from the 10th century, a royal feast ended in bloodshed when a minor noble, emboldened by too much ale, accused another of cowardice in battle. The result? A fatal duel behind the hall, two families thrown into years of bitter resentment, and a king forced to play mediator to a mess created over slurred insults and stale barley. The mead hall was not a place for total abandon. Lords were expected to maintain order even during drinking. One way they did this was through the telling of tales, a well-timed story, especially one that reminded drinkers of fallen heroes or past betrayals, could steer a gathering away from edge-of-a-sword conflict. The scop, or bard, was not just a source of entertainment. He was, in effect, the mood manager of the feast. His songs reminded men of their mortality, their duties, their past, and most importantly, their limits. But the human body does not always care for the poetry of restraint. And so, sometimes, things fell apart. There are references in legal codes, like King In's laws from Wessex, to punishments for crimes committed while drunk, fines, floggings, even exile. These laws don't just suggest that drunken misbehavior existed, they revealed that it was common enough to need regulation. The drink was not a scapegoat, but neither was it an excuse. Anglo-Saxon justice did not often distinguish between sober crime and drunken crime. Your actions, drink or no drink, belonged to you, and yet the drink continued to flow. Why? Why continue this dangerous ritual, knowing its risks? Partly, of course, because there were no better options. Water, as previously mentioned, was often unsafe. Ale and mead were more reliable. But more deeply, the answer lies in how central communal drinking was to the concept of identity. To abstain was to isolate, to misstep was to endanger, but to navigate it well, to drink, to remember, to boast without offense, To laugh without mockery was to be part of the world in full. The mead hall was a stage. You had to perform. The risk of drinking wasn't a side effect. It was part of the experience. Over time, as England Christianized, the church began to eye this world of drink and drama with suspicion. Drunkenness was increasingly condemned in sermons. Some writers equated mead halls with dens of sin, where lust, pride, and gluttony danced freely. And yet, paradoxically, many monasteries brewed some of the strongest drink. It wasn't the alcohol itself. The church hated it, was its misuse. So, they created guidelines. Feast days were controlled. Monks were limited in how much they could drink, often a set number of cups per day. A curious contradiction. They brewed it, blessed it, and warned against it, sometimes all in the same scroll. As Anglo-Saxon society moved toward the later medieval period, the mead hall, as a political and social center, began to fade. Stone castles replaced timber halls, more formal courts and ecclesiastical power began to replace the communal politics of the cup. But even as the physical space changed, the legacy of mead lived on. Toasts continued. Drink still sealed deals. The mead hall was more than a bar. It was a place where memory lived, where reputations were shaped, and where restraint walked a narrow path beside revelry. To drink in Anglo-Saxon England was to participate in a careful, precarious dance between order and chaos, identity and excess. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson hidden in the foam of an ancient cup, that community, like fermentation, is a living thing, easily spoiled, delicately maintained, and always bubbling just beneath the surface. If you walk through the crumbling remains of a medieval abbey today, you may hear echoes of chanting, the rustle of robes, maybe even the hush of centuries-old silence. But what you likely won't hear or smells the simmering of malted barley, the burble of fermentation, or the dull thud of wooden mash paddles stirring thick wort in stone basins. And yet, for much of the Middle Ages, monasteries across Europe were not only sanctuaries of prayer and scholarship, they were also some of the most innovative, prolific, and quietly competitive breweries the world had ever seen. To understand how beer became sacred, you have to understand what monks were trying to do. Their daily lives revolved around the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century guidebook that prescribed a monastic life of discipline, simplicity, and stability. Among its many detailed instructions were rules on food and drink, no excess, moderation in all things, and communal meals. It was not supposed to be indulgent. Wine was allowed, yes, but sparingly. And yet, very quickly, monks found that beer, cheap, nutritious, and relatively easy to make, fit rather snugly into the routine of the cloister. Especially in Northern Europe, where grapes were unreliable and winters long, beer was not just tolerated, it was embraced. Monastic brewing didn't begin as an art form. Early monastic beers were probably murky, sour, low in alcohol, and often drank more for sustenance than for pleasure. Monks needed something filling, especially during fasting seasons. Bread was banned at certain times. Beer, conveniently, was not. This led to a clever theological workaround. Beer became liquid. Bread. Brewing began in the grain fields, often owned and worked by the monastery. Barley, wheat, or rye had to be harvested, malted meaning soaked, sprouted, and dried in then ground into a rough flour. That malted grain was then mashed with hot water to extract sugars, creating a thick, sweet liquid called wort. This was then boiled, strained, and left to ferment in open barrels or casks. The entire process could take days, and cleanliness, in pre-modern conditions, was a constant struggle. Monks didn't understand yeast as we do today, but they learned that reusing the same vessels or adding dregs from a successful batch often resulted in more reliable fermentation. Slowly, a science developed quietly, methodically, within cloister walls. What made monastic beer different from peasant or tavern beer was not just method, but scale and intention. Monasteries could produce enough to serve dozens, sometimes hundreds, of mouths. And they weren't just brewing for themselves. Hospitality was a core monastic value. Travelers, pilgrims, and the sick were all entitled to food and drink when they arrived at a monastery. Beer, therefore, wasn't just an internal matter. It was part. To offer good beer was, in a sense, to evangelize through hospitality. But beer also became a quiet economic powerhouse. As demand grew, many monasteries began selling surplus beer to local communities. By the 11th and 12th centuries, breweries in parts of what is now Belgium, Germany, and northern France were producing beer that was widely sought after. Some even developed reputations beyond their local region. These weren't giant industrial operations, far from it. They were more akin to well-run artisan setups, deeply rooted in local ingredients, precise in technique, and surprisingly competitive. And here's where it gets more fascinating. Monks didn't just stick with traditional methods. They experimented, they improved. One of the most impactful innovations was the use of hops, the bitter flowers that flavor and preserve beer. While hops had been known since Roman times, it was monastic brewers who began incorporating them regularly into the brew, particularly in the Low Countries and German lands. Hops helped beer last longer, made it more palatable, and opened the door to trade. A monastery that could brew a hoppy, stable beer could sell it far from home, even export it across borders. And all of this was happening in silence, or at least in whispered tones over steaming kettles and dripping casks. Brewing was not some hidden monastic secret, but it was folded into the rhythms of cloister life. Prayer, work, reading, brewing, resting, brewing again. And because monks kept records, bless them, they wrote down their processes, annotated their ingredient ratios, and sometimes even illustrated the vessels. The result? A slow, methodical improvement of brewing techniques that would lay the groundwork for modern beer. But monks weren't just brewing beer, they were shaping culture. In places where feudal lords could be capricious and tavern owners disreputable, the monastery offered something strange: reliability. Monastic beer became known for its consistency. You knew what you were getting. In some ways, it was the Middle Ages' closest equivalent to a trusted brand. The logo wasn't a label. It was the abbey wall and the habit of the man handing you the cup. Yet even within the monasteries, tensions arose. Was this too profitable, too indulgent? Should a place of humility be producing beer for sale? There were debates, sometimes sharp ones. Some abbots banned outside sales altogether. Others expanded their operations. And still others doubled down on making their beer the best in the region. Spiritual anxieties be damned. So how did these humble, cloistered brewers manage to spread their beer across a continent? How did something meant to be part of religious life become a symbol of quality and trade? By the 12th century, monastic beer had quietly transformed from humble sustenance into a quiet empire distributed not with armies or edicts, but in barrels, on carts, and by the persuasive authority of taste and trust. While the outside world was filled with banditry, barons, and boiling tensions between kings and popes, behind monastery walls, another kind of order prevailed, one that ran on time, repetition, discipline, and drink. Monastic beer succeeded because it was stable, and stability was rare. The average medieval town could offer ale that ranged from pleasant to putrid, depending on the season, the brewer's health, or whether a rat had drowned in the mash barrel. Monastic beer, by contrast, was predictable, palatable, and, more importantly, replicable. Monks, trained to copy manuscripts letter by letter, brought that same precision to recipes. They documented mash temperatures, water sources, grain-to-liquid ratios, and seasonal variations with the diligence of men who believed that God watched both their handwriting and their wort. But beer wasn't just about God, it was about economics. And this was where things got interesting. As towns began to grow in the high Middle Ages and trade routes expanded across Europe, monasteries found themselves uniquely positioned. Many were built along pilgrimage paths, river crossings, and crossroads designed for spiritual traffic, yes, but perfectly suited to commercial opportunity. Beer brewed in the abbey could be sold to travelers, pilgrims, merchants, and even local taverns. And as word spread, some monasteries became known not just for relics or miracles, but for a particularly satisfying pint. This expanding trade prompted innovations in infrastructure. Some monasteries built larger brew houses, separated from their refectories or cloisters. Others dug deep cellars to store barrels and invested in better casks for transport. And yes, monks began to specialize. A particularly gifted brewer might spend his entire monastic life perfecting the balance between bitterness and sweetness in a beer meant for the feast of St. Martin. Another might develop a summer ale lighter in body but easier to ferment in warmer weather. This wasn't just sustenance, it was becoming craft, and yet, despite the growing demand, the product remained tied to purpose. Monastic beer wasn't brewed for profit alone. It was part of a larger system of charity and hospitality. Most abbeys maintained a stranger's tap, a spout, or barrel from which free beer was distributed to travelers and the poor. This wasn't the bottom of the barrel swill either. Often it was a second or third batch, brewed from reused grains, but still nourishing and safe to drink. A good monastery was judged not just by the piety of its monks, but by the generosity of its brewdot. At the same time, internal debates began to stir. Should monks be brewing for outsiders? Should the cloister be known for commerce as much as contemplation? Some stricter orders, like the Cistercians, imposed limitations on how much contact monks could have with lay customers. They attempted to channel all sales through lay brothers, members of the monastic community, who didn't take full vows and could handle more worldly matters. It was a compromise that allowed the ale to flow while maintaining a fiction of spiritual detachment. Still, the tension remained. As monastic breweries grew richer and more respected, their output could outpace the monastery's needs. In some cases, abbeys became local monopolies, pushing out smaller brewers or setting quality expectations so high that others couldn't compete. Towns began to petition for the right to brew independently. In response, some monasteries doubled down even more refined products, experimenting with flavorings like coriander, anise, or wild herbs. What had begun as a food substitute had now become a market commodity. And then came the guilds. By the 13th and 14th centuries, urban brewing guilds, secular commercial, and increasingly male-dominated, began to challenge the monastic hold on beer production. These guilds introduced regulations, set prices, and lobbied for exclusive rights in their towns. They standardized ale measurement, taxed sales, and imposed quality inspections. For monasteries used to brewing on their own terms, this was both a nuisance and a threat. Some monasteries adapted, joining guilds and negotiating privileges. Others withdrew, focusing only on internal production. Still others leaned into quality and mystique, marketing their beer as cleaner, holier, and more authentic than the tavern swill of the towns. In this way, monastic beer became not just a drink, but a brand. The cowl and the cross became symbols of trust. If it came from the abbey, you knew what you were getting. Of course, not every abbey brewed equally. Some were renowned for dark, strong ales meant to sustain monks through Lenten fasts. Others specialized in light table beer, barely alcoholic, meant to be drunk in large quantities at communal meals. Some monasteries produced 3 or even 4 grades of beer, one for monks, one for guests, one for sale, and one for the poor. This stratification mirrored medieval society itself. Liquid hierarchy, served in different cups. By the late Middle Ages, the role of beer in monastic life had become both practical and symbolic. Brewing was no longer just about nourishment. It was about reputation, charity, discipline, and even subtle power. A monastery known for poor beer might find its guesthouse empty. One known for excellent brewing might see more pilgrims, more donations, and more local favor. But even the best brewing monks couldn't escape what was coming. Disease, war, and, most fatefully, reform. As the Protestant Reformation loomed on the horizon, so too did new challenges to the monastic way of life, including its brewing traditions. Monasteries would soon find their lands confiscated, their barrels smashed, and their sacred sips labeled as signs of indulgence rather than industry. So what happened when the cloisters fell silent, not just in prayer, but in brew? How did monastic beer survive the storms of Reformation, plague, and political upheaval? As the 16th century dawned, the monasteries of Europe, many of them with centuries of brewing excellence under their habit, stood at a crossroads. Their beer had nourished the poor, welcomed pilgrims, and built reputations that stretched far beyond the abbey walls. But a slow, powerful force was building, one that would not only question their religious authority, but sweep away their very foundations. The Protestant Reformation was not just a spiritual upheaval, it was an economic and cultural earthquake. And when it hit, the alehouses of God were not spared. In England, the blow came swiftly. Between 1536 and 1541, under the direction of Thomas Cromwell and the orders of Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries brought centuries of cloistered brewing to a near-instant halt. Abbey after abbey was stripped of its lands, its treasures, and yes, its brewhouses. Barrels were broken, cellars emptied, and monastic recipes, water to fire, were lost, abandoned, or absorbed by enterprising brewers who moved into the monastic ruins like ivy. The old stone halls, once echoing with chant and the hiss of steam, fell silent. Elsewhere in Europe, the process was more gradual but no less disruptive. In Germany, Martin Luther's revolt against the Catholic Church encouraged secular authorities to seize properties. In some places, this meant breweries were shuttered. In others, they were simply converted to secular use. Monastic beer, once considered a holy product, was now viewed with skepticism, too indulgent, too profitable, too papist. Reformers decried what they saw as luxurious excess masquerading as piety. And yet, ironically, many Protestant leaders allowed former monastic breweries to keep operating under lay management. Beer, after all, was too valuable to waste. But the story didn't end in destruction. Far from it. In Catholic regions, particularly in parts of Belgium, southern Germany, and Austria, monastic brewing persisted and even evolved. Some abbeys managed to navigate the political upheaval, securing patronage or protection from sympathetic nobles. Others scaled back, focusing on brewing purely for internal use or charitable distribution. A few adapted cleverly, branding their beers more explicitly as monastic in identity, leaning into the very qualities the reformers criticized: tradition, richness, devotion. The Trappists, in particular, emerged as champions of this legacy. Trappist brewing, which took shape in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a response to both religious reform and market demand. These Cistercian monks revived the old methods but emphasized self-sufficiency, prayerful labor, and minimal commercial ambition. They brewed strong, complex beers rich in malt, subtly spiced, and aged with care. These were not cheap tavern drinks. They were contemplative ales, meant to be savored slowly, much like the lives of the men who brewed them. Proceeds supported the abbey and its charitable work. The beer was not a product, but an extension of prayer. In time, Trappist beers became legendary. Chimay, Westmail, Orville, names that today still grace the shelves of specialty shops and the lips of enthusiasts, their roots directly to the monastic brewing tradition. These beers are known not just for their flavor, but for their rules. To bear the Trappist label, a beer must be brewed within a monastery, under monastic supervision, and not for profit. In an age of industrial brewing, this commitment to quiet integrity feels almost radical. But beyond the monasteries that survived or were reborn, there remained another legacy: the quiet fingerprints of monastic brewing on the larger culture of beer. Many secular brewers, especially in the late medieval and early modern periods, learned their craft from monks, inherited their equipment, or acquired their lands. Techniques like multi-stage fermentation, careful water sourcing, or the structured use of hops often began in cloistered halls. Even today, some modern craft breweries name their beers after long-lost abbeys, or use imagery of robed figures to evoke that old-world trust. The irony is that the monks, who never sought fame and often avoided the markets, became accidental legends. Their beer wasn't created for commerce, yet it became a symbol of quality. They weren't chasing trends, yet they innovated ahead of their time. Their brewing was a chore, a ritual, and a prayer, all rolled into one. And perhaps that's why their legacy endures. In a world of shifting fashions and forgettable flavors, monastic beer stands for something older, steadier, and quietly profound. It reminds us that even in silence, even in service, craft matters. That the pursuit of excellence, even when no one is watching, can shape the world in ways both unexpected and lasting. So the next time you sip a cloudy ale or a hoppy brew, remember the monks who boiled barley in stone kettles and stirred their wort between psalms. They weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying to make something honest, something useful, something good. And in that small, quiet act they did. Before beer became a business run by men in breweries and guilds, it was women, thousands of them, nameless in most records, but central to the heartbeat of daily life, who kept Europe brewing. These were the alewives, the brewsters, the mothers and daughters, who stirred, strained, sold, and served the beer that kept medieval society alive. Long before hops, pints, and purity laws, ale was a domestic task like baking bread or churning butter. But unlike those other chores, brewing could bring in coin, status, and suspicion, especially when a woman brewed too well. In early medieval Europe, brewing was a household craft. The beer of this period, technically ale, since hops were often absent, was consumed by nearly everyone, every day. It was weak by modern standards, but nourishing and safe. Water was unreliable, often dangerous. Ale, with its mild alcohol content and short shelf life, was a necessary part of the diet, not a luxury. Children drank it, laborers depended on it. And since most food preparation happened within the home, it was women who took charge of the brewpot. The word brewster originally denoted a female brewer, just as Webster meant a female. Weaver and spinster, a female spinner. These weren't just gender markers, they were professional identities. And while many women brewed purely for household use, a surprising number brewed for sale. In towns and villages across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries, women could be found ladling foaming cups of ale into earthenware jugs, collecting pennies in aprons, and shouting from open windows when the ale was fresh. Brewing was seasonal, tied to temperature and ingredients. Most alewives brewed in small batches, using malted barley or oats, sometimes thickened with bread or flavored with herbs like groot, rosemary, or yarrow. The ale had to be drunk within a few days, or it would spoil. That meant constant brewing, constant selling, and constant risk. A spoiled batch meant wasted grain. A bad reputation could sink your trade. A neighbor's whisper could ruin your standing. Alewives often marked their homes with a broomstick or greenery above the door, a crude signpost for the thirsty. Some had benches out front. Others simply opened their kitchens to passersby. There were no formal taverns in many places. The alehouse was just a house with ale. The line between domestic and public space blurred. For some women, brewing became their primary income. Widows, especially, found freedom in the fermenting tub, using ale to support themselves when few other trades were open. But success brought scrutiny. As towns grew and markets expanded, male merchants and guilds began to eye brewing as more than a cottage task. In cities like London and Paris, brewing guilds started forming networks of men who wanted to control quality, price, and reputation. These guilds rarely welcomed women. Some explicitly barred them. Others imposed rules that made it hard for small-scale female brewers to compete. Requirements for larger equipment, licensing fees, taxes, and inspections. As a result, the image of the alewife began to shift. No longer simply the helpful neighbor with the best brew, she became, in the eyes of moralists and town officials, a problem. Alewives were accused of watering down their ale, cheating customers, shouting in the streets, operating without licenses, and disrupting the peace. Satirical poems and sermons began to paint them as greedy, loud, even lascivious. In some towns, public punishments were introduced. A alewife who overcharged or served poor-quality ale could be put in the pillory or forced to drink her own spoiled brew. Strangely, some of the earliest visual symbols that we now associate with witches, the broomstick, the cauldron, the pointed hat, were likely drawn from popular images of alewives. The hat made her visible in a crowd. The broom was her signpost, the cauldron her tool. It's no accident that as male brewers gained economic control, the public image of the female brewer morphed into something darker, more suspicious, more punishable, and yet the alewives endured. In villages far from guild control, they continued, brewing as they had for generations. Recipes were passed down orally, methods adjusted with weather and season. Brewing knowledge remained, stubbornly female even as the law, the market, and the city walls tried to fence it off. But what were the lives of these women really like? How did they manage children, brewing, and trade all at once? What happened when their ale failed, or their neighbors turned against them? Were they really cheats and troublemakers, or just women trying to survive in a world that increasingly wanted them silent? To brew ale in the Middle Ages was to dance daily with fire, fermentation, and fickle fortune. For the women who bore the title of alewife or brewster, this was no idle pastime. It was an act of economic necessity, communal responsibility, and, increasingly, social defiance. Their work filled tankards and stomachs across Europe, yet their names, like the froth on a quickly poured mug, vanished almost as fast. Still, through records of fines, court rolls, and the angry complaints of men, we catch glimpses of their lives and the bitter backlash their brewing sometimes stirred. The brewing itself was physical, sweaty, and exacting. It began before dawn, soaking malted grain, boiling the mixture in heavy iron pots, straining the wort through straw or cloth, and cooling it in shallow tubs before fermentation. Some alewives reused sediment from past batchesithers, relied on wild fermentation, counting on luck and airflow to deliver the yeast. The final ale had to be ready fast within 2 or 3 days, or it would sour. A warm week could ruin the timing. A cracked pot could drain the profits. There were no thermometers, no hydrometers, no preservatives, just hands, heat, and hope. And even when a batch succeeded, the sale itself brought danger. In market towns like York, Bruges, and Rouen, alewives competed with one another in tight quarters. Space was limited, and so was goodwill. Selling from home meant customers entered the domestic space, sometimes bringing business, sometimes trouble. A spilled cup could lead to an accusation of overcharging. A loud customer might prompt complaints to the town watch. Neighbors could easily turn into rivals. Municipal ale testers and town officials, typically male and increasingly guild-affiliated, inspected ale for strength and quality. This wasn't a courtesy, it was law, and violations, even minor ones, were punished publicly. In London, alewives who sold understrength ale could be forced to sit on the cucking stool, a form of public shaming involving dunking or display. In York, they might be fined or forced to pour their own spoiled ale down the drain before an audience. These acts weren't just punishment, they were performance, designed to remind the town who belonged in the marketplace and who didn't. Despite this, records show women paid these fines repeatedly on continued brewing. It was worth it. Brewing brought in more income than spinning or midwifery for many women. A single successful batch could feed a family for a week. Some widows or single women built small empires of ale, hiring others to help, or even managing apprentices. And while some were known for cutting corners or serving thin ale, others developed reputations for excellence. Their homes became popular gathering spots. Their names, though occasionally appear in court records as figures of respect, but their position remained precarious. The medieval economy had little tolerance for independent women, especially those who handled money, customers, and alcohol all at once. The combination of female authority, strong drink, and open trade created unease among the male-dominated guilds. These tensions hardened in the late medieval period, particularly as brewing scaled up. What had once been an open household task began to be fenced in by commercial interests. With the rise of hops in brewing, a botanical shift that dramatically extended ale's shelf life, commercial breweries gained a major advantage. Hopped beer could be transported, stored, and sold over wider distances. This shift favored larger operations, usually run by men, and pushed women brewers to the margins. Laws changed, often subtly. New taxes, equipment standards, or licensing fees that excluded smaller-scale alewives in towns like Coventry and Chester. Guild records began to list fewer and fewer female names by the late 15th century, and with this economic marginalization came cultural slander. The same sermons that once warned against tavern sin now named alewives directly, casting them as corrupters of youth, tempters of virtue, even servants of the devil. In literature, the comic figure of the alewife, loud, fat, lusty, deceit. In popularity, she was blamed for drunkenness, brawls, and disorder, regardless of the truth. In a world where most drink still came from a woman's hand, society began to recoil from that image with suspicion. Even more chillingly, some scholars argue that this cultural shift helped lay the groundwork for the witch panics of the early modern period. The symbols of the alewife, her cauldron, her broomstick, her pointed hat worn at markets, were easily transformed into signs of sorcery. A woman who brewed alone, spoke her mind, and had knowledge of herbs. She was a healer, a brewer, and, eventually, perhaps, a witch. In this way, economic displacement became cultural demonization. The bitter taste of exclusion lingered long after the ale was gone, and yet, we must not forget, the ale still flowed in smaller villages, especially those far from guilds or trade centers. Women continued to brew. Some passed down their methods across generations, quietly resisting the trend. In convents, nuns brewed for their sisters and for the poor. Even in cities, a few determined women retained brewing rights, often through inheritance or privilege. Their work fed communities, sustained tradition, and preserved the knowledge that commercial brewing alone could never fully contain. So what became of this legacy? Did it vanish with the rise of male brewers, or does it still linger perhaps, even in the very language of brewing? And what of the women whose names were never written, but whose ale kept a continent on its feet? By the time the printing press rolled out its first pages and the modern state began to flex its early muscles, the era of the alewife was waning. The transition from hand-stirred ale in cottage kitchens to large-scale, guild-regulated beer halls was not swift, but it was relentless. In town after town, female names vanished from brew rolls, slowly replaced by male guild members, official city brewers, and commercial operations backed by capital rather than cauldrons. But the decline of recorded female brewers does not mean their legacy disappeared. Quite the opposite, it simply became absorbed into the fabric of history. Uncredited but undeniably present, in some places the loss was obvious. In London, by the 16th century, the powerful, worshipful company of brewers and all-male guild controlled nearly all legal brewing. The alewives, who had once dominated the streets with signs of evergreen boughs and broomsticks, were increasingly fined out of existence or driven into unlicensed back alleys. In cities across the Holy Roman Empire, brewing privileges were tied to citizenship, property ownership, and guild membership barriers that few women could cross. In this sense, regulation became erasure. The law didn't always forbid women from brewing, it simply made it impossible. But in the countryside, traditions died slower. In hamlets and manor estates, women continued to brew small batches for neighbors, families, and farmhands. These brews rarely show up in records, not because they didn't exist, but because they existed in the unseen domestic economy, the world of informal exchange, barter, and community support. Some of the brewing recipes that survived into the early modern period came not from official guilds or professional breweries, but from household manuscripts, cookbooks, herbals, and domestic guides passed from mother to daughter. We see glimpses of this legacy in the language. The word brewster, though it faded from use, never fully vanished. In some dialects, it lingered into the 18th century as a quiet nod to its female origins. The phrase good alewife persisted in English ballads and rural songs, evoking a woman who could not only brew well, but also manage a household, host travelers, and command respect. Even the common image of the friendly tavern keeper, the matronly woman with a ladle and a sharp tongue, echoes these earlier figures, even as the realities behind them were forgotten. In other corners of Europe, the tradition found curious ways to survive. In Flanders and parts of northern France, some widows retained brewing licenses through legal loopholes. In the Alps, nuns brewed quietly in convents well into the 17th century. And in Scandinavia, farmhouse ale traditions, often managed by women, continued in parallel with urban breweries. These women brewed for weddings, funerals, and holidays, keeping alive methods that had barely changed since Viking times. Modern brewing owes much to this invisible army. The careful timing of temperature changes, the reuse of sediment, the experimentation with herbs and adjuncts, these were not innovations of guilds or industrialists. They were practices honed over centuries by women in smoky kitchens and open courtyards. Women who brewed not to profit or scale, but to survive. The precision and instinct that guided their hands laid the groundwork for what would later become a science. And yet, when beer history is told today, their names are seldom spoken. We hear of Bavarian purity laws, Trappist monasteries, and German lager pioneers, but not of Alice Atkin, fined 4 times in 1391 for strong ale that sold out before officials could inspect it, or of Marjorie Kemp, better known for her spiritual visions, who also tried and failed to run a profitable brewing business, or of the nameless woman in York who brewed each Friday to feed her grandchildren, her name now lost in a mildew-stained parchment, the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. 2. Cast long shadows. Some scholars argue that as brewing became male-dominated and suspicion of independent women grew, the old image of the alewife, the cauldron, the herbs, the solitary figure became easy fodder for fear. While no direct line can be drawn, the cultural slippage is undeniable. A woman who brewed alone, who sold her product with confidence, who mixed herbs with skill. She could be admired in one decade and burned in the next, but history has a way of foaming back up in recent decades. The brewing world has begun to rediscover its foremothers. Ale festivals now include tributes to the women who kept beer alive through centuries of silence. Scholars dig through court rolls and manorial records, hunting for traces of their names. And in kitchens and small breweries across the world, the tradition lives again, not as novelty, but as heritage. To sip a well-made ale is to taste that history, the grains stirred by calloused hands, the steam rising from an open pot, the whispered lessons passed between generations. It's a legacy brewed in homes, punished in markets, erased from records on, now slowly being remembered. So when you lift your glass, perhaps pause a moment, not just for the monks or the guilds, but for the alewife with her ladle, standing at her door centuries ago, offering warmth, wit, and one more cup before night fell. Step into a medieval tavernot, the sanitized, dimly lit fantasy version, with goblets and fire-breathing minstrels, but the real thing. The floor is packed, dirt, swept occasionally, but never truly clean. The benches are rough-hewn, the ceilings low, and the smell yeast wood smoke, sweat, old ale clings to the air like a second skin. The light is thin, drifting in from high, narrow windows or flickering from rushlights on the wall. It's noisy but not chaotic, busy but not lawless. Because even here, in the world of drink and dice, rules apply. Just not the kind found in law books. Medieval pubs were not free-for-alls. They were tightly coded spaces, shaped by custom ritual, and a subtle pecking order, enforced not by officials, but by the patrons themselves. If you didn't know the rules, you'd find out soon enough, through a cold shoulder, a sharp word, or a swift shove. The alehouse was both refuge and arena, a place where you could unwind, gossip, plan, or get punched, depending on your timing. Let's start with the entrance. Taverns, inns, and alehouses were often distinguished more by function than appearance. An inn provided lodging and food, often for travelers. A tavern was where wine was sold. An alehouse or public house served ale and beer. In practice, the terms often overlapped. What mattered was what was served, who came, and who ran it. In rural villages, the alehouse might be little more than someone's front room with a bench and a barrel. In market towns, it might have several rooms, a back garden, and a sign hanging above the door, perhaps a boot, a lion, or a sheaf of grain. But signs weren't just decoration. They served a practical purpose. Most of the population was illiterate. A distinctive sign helped customers identify a familiar place. It also acted as a kind of brand. The Dog and Duck might be known for its cheap ale, while the Silver Cup drew wealthier clientele with imported wine and a stricter sense of order. In some cities, authorities required alehouses to display signs so inspectors and constables could more easily monitor them. Once inside, the rules began. You didn't just shout for ale. In many establishments, tokens were used, small pieces of wood or lead purchased from the tavern keeper and exchanged for a drink. These tavern tokens helped prevent theft, smoothed over disputes about payment, and allowed tavern owners to keep a better count of what was owed. For regulars, tokens could function like credit. For newcomers, they were a silent reminder that you were being watched. There were expectations about seating, too. The better benches were for regulars, wealthier patrons, or the local reeve and his drinking friends. Newcomers sat near the door, the hearth, or worst of all, the privy. Social standing was not erased in the tavern. It was simply rearranged. A wealthy man could find himself mocked if he overstepped his bounds, while a clever or well-liked peasant might earn a favored place near the tap. Status could be renegotiated here, but only within limits. Noise had rules. Singing was common, even encouraged. But certain songs might be considered offensive, or worse, provocative. Political tunes could land you in trouble if the wrong ears were present. Likewise, speaking too loudly or slamming your cup in the wrong rhythm could signal challenge or insult. Table slapping, especially, had meanings. Once for another round, twice to demand attention, 3 times depending on region, might mean I'm out of patience. Misuse the code, and someone might answer with fists instead of ale. Dice, games, and gambling were widespread, but not always legal. In England, repeated attempts were made to ban tavern gambling, particularly among the lower classes. Authorities worried that soldiers and laborers wasted wages that should go to bread and taxes, yet enforcement was spotty at best. In many alehouses, dice games occurred under the table, behind a screen, or after a wink from the tavern keeper. Winning too much, however, was dangerous. A streak of good luck could sour a room quickly. Accusations of cheating were common, and medieval taverns were not places where people resolved such things quietly. Food might be available, but not always. Some establishments offered hot stews, bread, or salted fish, while others allowed patrons to bring their own. Plates were rare. Most food was eaten with hands, knives, and communal bowls. Bones went under the bench. Complaints about the food, especially, if spoken aloud, could quickly earn you the tavern keeper's enmity. And then there were the alewives. Some taverns were run by women, often widows or mothers, supplementing their income. Others employed female servers. These women often walked a narrow line between hospitality and suspicion. Sermons railed against alewives as corrupters of virtue. Plays mocked them as nagging cheats. Yet in practice, they were essential. Many knew their regulars' habits, served as informal mediators in disputes, and even provided credit or support. In lean seasons, a good alewife might keep a tavern running. A bad one might shut it down with scandal. At the center of it all was the tavern keeper, figure part host, part referee, part enforcer. He, or occasionally she, determined who stayed, who left, and how far the rules could bend. In a world without police patrols or surveillance, the tavern keeper's authority was largely personal. Lose control of your patrons, and the authorities might shut you down. But handle things well, and your tavern could become the beating heart of a neighborhood, a place where alliances were made, rumors spread, and the pulse of the town could be read in the foam atop a cup. But not all taverns were equal. What separated a quiet, respectable house from a den of thieves and fistfights? And what happened when the unspoken rules broke down? When a spilled drink or a misplayed token became the spark for something far more dangerous? As much as medieval taverns were social havens, they were equally recognized as pressure cookers, sites where the routine rhythms of community life could, with the right provocation, boil over into something far less charming. Because no matter how many unspoken codes governed the bench or the cup, there was always someone willing or drunk enough to break them. The most common cause of tavern disputes wasn't politics or religion or even love. It was debt. Taverns ran on trust, and tabs were widespread. But defaulting on a tab wasn't just a personal slight, it was a public insult. Everyone saw it, everyone remembered, and if someone else picked up your debt, it could bind them to you in a way you hadn't agreed to. These tensions sometimes erupted in slurs, then fists, and in rare cases, knives. Alehouses also carried the risk of disorder simply due to what they were: gathering spaces for tired people. Armed with wooden mugs and short tempers, the seating arrangements might reflect hierarchy, but they didn't always protect against resentment. If a low-status man sat too close to the Reeves bench, or a known troublemaker demanded a favored corner, disputes began. These infractions might seem minor: misplaced coat, an elbow in the wrong stew pot, but they disrupted the balance. And in a setting where social standing could be fragile, perceived disrespect mattered more than actual harm. The tavern keeper's job was to walk a tightrope between enforcement and appeasement. Most tried to avoid involving outside authorities. Bringing in the town watch could endanger a tavern's license, or, worse, bring down guild scrutiny or ecclesiastical attention. So problems were often resolved in a brawl might be allowed to burn itself out, with chairs overturned and noses bloodied, as long as no one drew steel or broke the door. In some towns, tavern keepers hired taproom heavies, regulars paid in ale or coin, to help restore order when things got rowdy. Their presence was unspoken, their interventions swift, but not all fights were physical. Some were performed through words-long, winding insults designed to shame a man without violating the law. In many places, this was an art form. These flightings or ritualized verbal duels served both as entertainment and pressure release. They tested wit, memory, and nerve. One wrong phrase, however, and the exchange could pivot from poetry to violence. There's a reason many taverns banned singing after the third cup. Then there was the matter of banned topics. While free speech didn't exist in the medieval sense, taverns were still sites of surprisingly frank conversation within reason. You could mock the weather, the local grain merchant, or even the bishop with care, but criticize the king, question the legitimacy of a war, or joke about the Virgin Mary. and someone might report you. Seditious speech was a serious crime. Towns employed informants, and in tense times, plague years, war seasons, tax collection authorities paid special attention to who said what after sundown to protect themselves. Tavern keepers often kept known men near the hearth, individuals whose reputations were solid enough to offer cover. If these regulars vouched for a conversation or warned it was going too far, the matter might be dropped. But without them, loose talk could land, both speaker and tavern keeper, in court. Many a court roll includes fines for uttering dangerous speech in alehouse, a phrase that could mean anything from mild sedition to a drunken attempt at prophecy. Another layer of complexity came with gender. Women were permitted in taverns, though in many places they were viewed with suspicion. Respectable women might enter with husbands or in groups, often sitting apart. Unaccompanied women, however, risked being labeled as prostitutes or worse, and indeed, many sex workers operated in or near taverns. These women, known in some records as tap wenches or public women, added both vitality and risk to the atmosphere. Their presence drew men and coin, but also moralists, church scrutiny, and town officials. The lines between alehouse, brothel, and boarding house were not always clear, especially in poorer districts. Some establishments offered private rooms, often curtained-off corners, where beer and bodily comfort were sold together. These spaces were tolerated in some regions, suppressed in others, and always watched closely. For tavern keepers, the balance between profit and risk was delicate. Too much noise, too many fights, too many rumors, and your license might vanish with a magistrate's wax seal. Still, most nights didn't end in chaos. Most taverns, most of the time, ran smoothly, not because of formal laws, but because of custom. Patrons understood the signals, how to gesture for another round without being greedy, how to greet a rival without provoking, how to leave when the mood soured. They knew the songs that diffused tension and the jokes that went too far. They learned from youth how to behave in the tavern and when to stop talking. And if they didn't learn, the lesson came fast. But what happened when the tavern itself became more than a drinking house, when it transformed into a center of resistance, a shadow court, or a place where conspiracies fermented alongside the ale? By the late Middle Ages, the medieval tavern had become more than a place to drink. It had evolved into a community ingénue, unofficial courthouse, rumor mill, poor man's council chamber, and sometimes a cradle for rebellion. While the outside world moved through cycles of war, famine, and taxation, the tavern remained steady, doors creaking open at dusk, cups filled and drained, benches worn smooth by elbows, and walls pulsing with talk. And behind that talk, always, the quiet suggestion that here away from the magistrates and lords something real was being negotiated. In rural villages, the tavern might double as a town hall. Court records from 14th and 15th century England and Flanders frequently mention meetings at the alehouse to settle disputes, fence lines, grazing rights, labor arguments. There was no formal authority presiding. Instead, a group of men, and occasionally women, gathered at a central table, mugs in hand, and worked it out. These weren't drunken arguments, but improvised justice systems, community arbitration where status, age, and reputation carried more weight than law books. Many taverns even kept their own informal records, wooden tallies, chalkboards, or tied bundles of scrap parchment tracking debts, agreements, even the results of village lotteries. A trusted tavern keeper became more than a vendor. He or she became a mediator, a note keeper, a social referee. In some places, the tavern keeper held keys to village storage barns, acted as witness to marriage negotiations, or hosted the priest's supper after evening prayers. He was, quite literally, the keeper of the peace and the ale. But there were shadows. In times of political strains, such as peasant revolts, urban uprisings, or heavy taxation, taverns became hubs of unrest. Here, in the low lamplight, people spoke more freely. Discontent fomented alongside beer. Tax collectors were mocked. Lords were cursed by name. And the possibility of resistance, quiet at first, then louder, began to take shape. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, many of the earliest calls to rebellion were whispered in taverns. Town constables noted that alehouses in Kent and Essex had grown too crowded in the weeks before the rising. In France, similar patterns emerged during the Jacquerie and other rural uprisings. Even in cities like Ghent or Florence, where guild politics were tightly controlled, taverns gave space for craftsmen to grumble, plan, and organize. Because, unlike the market square or the churchyard, taverns belonged to no one but themselves. Sometimes these mutterings spilled into song. Popular tunes with hidden meanings circulated from one alehouse to the next. A well-placed line about a blind crow stealing bread might mock a corrupt reeve. A verse about a dancing priest with empty pockets could satirize the local bishop. These songs were passed orally, altered with each repetition, and almost impossible to trace, making them the perfect vehicle for dissent. And in an age where seditious speech could lead to flogging, the anonymity of tavern walls mattered deeply. Even the architecture encouraged secrecy. Many taverns had low ceilings, corner benches, or side rooms curtained off from the main floor. Conversations could be staged quietly, behind mugs and within murmurs. A coin passed subtly, a nod exchanged, and a message delivered to towns over by morning. Spies were sometimes planted in these spaces, particularly during wartime or times of suspected unrest, but the tavern, by its very nature, resisted control. Of course, not every conspiracy was political. Some were personal. Affairs began here. Illicit deals were struck. Children conceived, secrets shared, debts arranged quietly to avoid shame. A landlord might broker the labor of an out-of-work farmer over a pint. A young man might confess something to the alewife he couldn't tell his parents. These quiet exchanges, repeated across thousands of small rooms across medieval Europe, formed a kind of emotional infrastructure. The tavern didn't just serve ale, it served honesty, risk, vulnerability, and when disaster struck, fire, flood, war, it was often the tavern that helped communities survive. Food could be cooked in bulk over its hearth. Shelter was offered on its floors. Collections for the bereaved or poor were organized over its benches. During plague years, many taverns remained open, even as fear spread. Some offered free drink to doctors, nurses, and priests. Others became makeshift hospitals, housing the sick when church buildings were full. In this way, the tavern straddled an impossible line, both indulgence and salvation. It was condemned by churchmen, taxed by kings, watched by yet loved by nearly everyone who passed through its door. Its power lay not in wealth or laws or theology, but in rhythm. It opened when the sun fell. It welcomed those with coin and those with none. It remembered stories long after their tellers had gone. And though many of these establishments crumbled or were swept away by later reforms, their echoes remain in pubs, in inns, in the very notion of the public house. Today's barstool banter owes a debt to the table slaps of centuries ago. The murmured deals, the boisterous songs, the knowing nods from behind a capal of it still lingers, like the scent of old hops in the walls. So the next time you walk into a quiet pub, find a seat near the hearth and order something simple. Consider this: you're sitting where judges and rebels, paupers and thieves, lovers and farmers once gathered, not to be governed, but to be heard. Picture this. The year is 1371. Somewhere along the border of France and England, a small group of foot soldiers huddle near a smoky fire. Their armor is dented, their boots caked with mud, and the cold wind slices through their thin cloaks. A battle is expected by morning, and what are they doing? Sharpening swords, perhaps, whispering prayers, but also passing a jug of ale. Laughing, slurring. One of them is already asleep, snoring with his back against a pack of arrows. In the world of modern warfare, this would be unthinkable. But in medieval Europe, drinking before battle wasn't always a failure of discipline. Sometimes it was the strategy. The image of a drunk soldier stumbling through the fog of war may seem like a comic invention, but it's grounded in historical truth. Alcohol, especially ale and wine, was deeply integrated into military life. In the Middle Ages, not just as an indulgence, but as a necessity, a reward, and occasionally a psychological tool. Medieval armies didn't have rations as we imagine them today. They had beer, and lots of it. Soldiers marched with barrels, drank at camps, and celebrated or mourned around communal cups. In fact, alcohol consumption was so routine that some military pay was distributed in drink. Rather than coin, start with the basics. Clean water was rarely available in the field. Streams and wells were unreliable at best, deadly at worst. Dysentery and cholera were common killers in camps. Long before swords touched flesh, fermented beverages, ale in England and the Low Countries, wine in France and Southern Europe, were safer. Low in alcohol but full of calories and mildly antiseptic, they were essential for hydration. Commanders understood this. When provisioning armies, they planned for barrels of drink as carefully as for swords or bread. In the 100 Years' War, English logistics officers often prioritized beer shipments from Flanders over food, and soldiers drank before battle, not just after. Why? Because alcohol dulled fear. It relaxed the limbs, warmed the blood, and, in moderate doses, helped men face the chaos ahead. Chroniclers record numerous instances of troops being given drink before a charge. During the Crusades, some French knights reportedly drank heavily the night before battle, believing the wine would bring divine favor or at least make the violence feel less real. Whether in sieges, raids, or open field clashes, drink was part of the ritual. In smaller conflicts, border skirmishes, feudal feuds, or local disputes, soldiers might show up half-drunk simply because they'd been roused from a tavern or feast. The lines between war and brawl were thin in these engagements. Sometimes the combatants were neighbors. Drinking before fighting wasn't so much rebellion as custom. A quick ale gave courage, a second gave bravado, a third made the outcome unpredictable. But commanders didn't always welcome this behavior. Military manuals of the later Middle Ages begin to reflect concerns about discipline, particularly as standing armies replaced temporary levies. Some commanders, like Bertrand du Guesclin of France, strictly forbade drinking before battle, citing its effect on focus and formation. Others tolerated it, so long as the men obeyed orders when it counted. English sources from the 14th century include warnings against drunken archers, noting that inebriation could disrupt volley timing and reduce accuracy and expensive failure when arrows were limited and valuable. Still, punishments were inconsistent. In camp, drunkenness could be overlooked if the men fought well. After all, bravery was the highest currency. A drunk who performed heroics might be praised. A sober coward would be punished. This fuzzy line made for a dangerous culture, one where excess could be excused, but only if it worked. A soldier who drank, staggered, then fell in the mud before battle might be mocked, flogged, or expelled. One who did the same and then took down 3 enemies, a legend, and there were legends. The tale of Sir John Hawkwood, the infamous English mercenary in Italy, includes more than one account of him allowing his men to drink before a surprise raid. Supposedly, the raucous noise and drunken singing actually lulled enemies into underestimating them. In one instance, a drunk brawl between 2 of his lieutenants ended in a bloodbath but also in a victory, as their frenzied state caught the enemy completely off guard. Whether these stories are fact or invention is beside the point. They reflect a larger truth, that in medieval warfare, unpredictability and intoxication sometimes walked hand in hand. There's also the issue of celebration. Winning a battle meant looting, and looting meant wine. After a victory, soldiers often gorged on whatever they found: food, drink, sometimes even ink, mistaken for liquor. In 1382, after the Battle of Rysbeck, French troops pillaged a monastery cellar and drank so heavily that they forgot to post sentries, nearly costing them the gains they'd won. Similar incidents were reported during the Scottish Wars of Independence, where captured English soldiers were sometimes found passed out with ale mugs still in hand. And yet, not all drunkenness was celebratory. Some soldiers drank to cope with wounds, with fear, with memories of what they'd done or failed to do. The term drunk on duty didn't carry the same moral weight it does today. In a world where painkillers didn't exist and trauma had no language, ale and wine were the only release. For some, drink was courage. For others, a shield. For a few, the only friend that didn't die on the field. But what happened when drinking was the reason a battle was lost? Who took the blame? And how did commanders balance the need for morale against the risk of madness in the cup? Alcohol might have dulled fear and filled bellies, but it also cost lives and, sometimes, battles. As much as medieval commanders relied on drink to keep morale intact, it could quickly unravel the very discipline they needed to maintain. Between drinking for courage and drinking to disaster was a fine one, and it was crossed more often than most would. Admit the consequences of alcohol-induced chaos ranged from embarrassing to catastrophic. A disastrous crusade where overconfidence and poor discipline doomed the allied European forces before the battle even began. Many knights, particularly among the French contingents, feasted and drank lavishly the night prior. Contemporary chroniclers noted that the next day many of the young nobles were sluggish, overconfident. While not all were drunk during the battle itself, the atmosphere of indulgence and recklessness helped shape the disaster that followed. An ill-timed charge, the lesser-known incident of the 1327 siege of Weinsberg in Germany. A small garrison of defenders reportedly got into the captured wine supplies the night before a critical assault. When the enemy struck at dawn, they were groggy, disorganized, and, according to one observer, barely able to climb the walls in time. Though the town held out for another day, it ultimately fell. The commander survived, but his reputation did not. The phrase "drunken as Weinsberg's watchman" became a saying in the region for generations. Yet not all consequences were so dramatic. Often, drink simply made soldiers slow. Marches took longer, orders were misheard, horses were mistreated. In some cases, supply carts tipped over or were stolen outright while their guards slept off a hangover. In these moments, commanders had to decide, was the offense worth punishment, or was it simply part of the rough rhythm of campaigning life? Many commanders turned to regulation, drawing up rudimentary codes of conduct. The 15th century ordinances of war, issued by English generals during the 100 Years' War, included specific clauses on drunkenness. Men were forbidden from becoming unfit for service by ale or wine and were not to brawl while drunk. Within the camp, similar orders appeared in French and Burgundian armies, often with harsh penalties, flogging, pillory, or loss of pay. But enforcement varied. A drunk common soldier might be punished, a noble knight in his cups likely not. Some commanders, recognizing that they couldn't prevent drinking, tried instead to control its context. In some armies, drink was issued by company, not by man, allowing captains to ration it as they saw fit. In others, religious days or the eve of battle were marked by enforced sobriety, a brief window of dry discipline amid the wider haze of indulgence. But these restrictions didn't always hold. During the siege of Rouen in 1418 to 1419, English forces reportedly discovered a store of local wine early in the campaign. For days, discipline collapsed. Watch rotations were missed. Officers were ignored. Only after several soldiers died accidentally falling into the Seine while drunk did the commanders reassert control, destroying the remaining barrels and threatening executions. A harsh response, but one deemed necessary to prevent an even larger collapse of order. The problem wasn't just tactically, it was reputational. Armies, like individuals, had reputations to uphold. A force known for discipline and restraint might be feared. One known for drunken disorder might be mocked or underestimated. In medieval military culture, where image mattered as much as steel, an army's drinking habits could shape how allies and enemies alike treated it. And yet, despite the risks, commanders rarely banned drink entirely. Why? Because soldiers expected it, just as they expected their pay, their rations, and their place by the fire. They expected ale or wine. It wasn't a perk, was part of their identity. Denying drink too harshly could trigger unrest, even mutiny. During the Castilian campaigns in the 14th century, Several small-scale revolts were triggered by commanders withholding wine shipments in the heat of summer. Soldiers, already fatigued and poorly paid, saw this not as discipline but betrayal. Even among more elite forces, drinking was a point of camaraderie. The Teutonic Knights, for instance, maintained strict rules about monastic conduct, but made exceptions for celebrations after righteous battle. English longbowmen were known to sing and drink together the night before campaigns, moments that built bonds as much as they dulled nerves. These rituals weren't merely tolerated, they were woven into the fabric of service. There's also the curious role of drink in diplomacy. Toasting, often with dangerously strong wine, was a key part of forging alliances or resolving disputes. Refusing to drink with your host, especially in Eastern campaigns or among Germanic allies, could be seen as an insult. In some truce negotiations, the toasts lasted longer than the talking. These moments, while ceremonial, also carried strategic weight. A man who drank well and held his composure won respect. One who faltered lost more than just his cup. And amid all this, some turned their reliance on drink into legend. A few commanders cultivated reputations for being hard-drinking, hard-fighting men, the kind who could down a gallon of wine and still ride at dawn. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories inspired loyalty and awe. The truth was probably far less glamorous. Most men drank because the alternatives, fear, cold, silence, were worse. But if drink could bond and blind, sustain and sabotage, how did it shape the memory of battle? What stories were told afterward? And how much of what we remember was blurred by the fog, not of war but of wine? When the battle was over and the swords were sheathed, the drinking really began. Victory or defeat didn't matter. What mattered was that you were still alive and your throat was dry, and there was a cask nearby to remind you of something simpler than death. If battle was chaos, drinking afterward was ritual. A soldier's memories were formed in blood, but they were preserved in drink. Much of what we know, or think we know, about medieval battles comes not from court records or strategic maps, but from chroniclers, poems, ballads, and tavern tales. And these were shaped, often, by the drinking table. Heroes grew bolder over the second cup. Villains became more cowardly. The timing of charges, the sharpness of steel, the last words of fallen comrades all took on the soft blur of ale. Even disaster could be retold as comedy if enough wine flowed. Taverns, inns, and way stations were the post-battle memory factories of medieval Europe. There, over sloshing mugs and half-eaten bread, men reconstructed what they had seen or thought they had seen. They boasted of arrows caught mid-flight, of duels won with a broken dagger, of daring escapes beneath castle walls. Sometimes, the line between fact and fantasy wasn't just blurred, it vanished entirely. The more someone drank, the more their tale grew legs. A single successful blow became a victory. A clever retreat became a heroic stand. And a drunken stumble into the wrong camp became an espionage mission that saved the day. But memory through alcohol did more than inflate egos. It softened wounds. Medieval medicine was limited in what it could offer for physical pain, but for the unseen toll of war, there was almost nothing. Soldiers who had killed friends, looted villages, or watched comrades fall carried that weight silently. Ale didn't heal, but it muffled. It allowed stories to be retold in ways that made sense, or at least allowed men to laugh where they could have wept. This wasn't just denial. It was survival in some circles, especially among knights and mercenaries. Recounting battle over drink became a kind of performance art. Reputation depended on it. Retell it skillfully, and, when possible, outdrink your doubters. Drinking contests between rival captains were common, especially during truces or winter quarters. The man who could hold his ale and still recite his deeds became a minor celebrity, the one who passed out, forgotten. Interestingly, the church, which railed so hard against drunkenness among the general population, often turned a blind eye to battlefield drinking, so long as it didn't disrupt holy causes. Crusaders were routinely issued wine rations. Some clergy even joined in, blessing the drink before a fight or hosting feasts to celebrate victories. Monastic records show that abbeys near battlefields often hosted rest nights for wounded soldiers, complete with warm food, clean water, and ale to ease the pain. Even in their quiet cloisters, monks understood that a man who had faced death might need more than prayer. Literature, too, helped preserve the image of the drunken but valiant warrior. In the Song of Roland, Beowulf, and various chivalric romances, feasting and drinking come directly after combat. Heroes drink to forget, to remember, to bond. The connection between the cup and the sword becomes symbolic. Drink is what binds warriors together, not only in life, but in legend. This cultural thread ran deep, linking camaraderie, memory, and intoxication into a single fabric that outlasted any battlefield. But over time, perceptions began to shift. By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, as standing armies replaced temporary levies and professionalization took hold, the figure of the drunken soldier began to lose its romance. Military discipline tightened. Commanders demanded obedience over bravery. Nations, not individuals, now paid for wars, and they expected their investment not to fall into a wine barrel. Manuals stressed sobriety. Drill replaced bravado. And yet, in taverns and songs, the old image lingered. The man with scars, a mug, and 1,000 stories. Even today, echoes remain. The idea of the battle-hardened drinker, the soldier who's seen too much and drinks to forget, traces back to these medieval fields. It's there in the old war poems, in regimental traditions, in the raising of glasses to absent friends. The culture of drinking and fighting may have changed, but the memory remains etched into the same places where so many stories began, around a fire, beside a barrel, under a sky that no longer rains arrows. And so, the soldier's cup, wooden, metal, or ceramic, held more than ale. It held fear, pride, grief, and the desperate hope that the next battle might not come too soon, or that if it did, someone else would buy the first round afterward. In the modern world, water is a basic expectation, clear, cold, and hopefully clean, delivered with a turn of the tap. But in medieval Europe, water wasn't a given. It was a gamble. To drink straight from a stream or town well was to wager your health against a tide of invisible dangers: animal runoff, rotting waste, human sewage, or the slow seep of a nearby graveyard. And so, for much of the Middle Ages, Europeans lived in a state of quiet, continuous thirst. Not because they lacked liquid, but because they didn't trust it. Wine, ale, and other fermented drinks weren't just luxuries, they were survival tools. The low-level alcohol content in these beverages helped kill off pathogens. A weak beer or watered-down wine might not taste glamorous, but it was safer than whatever stood stagnant in the town fountain. In fact, for centuries, people of all ages, including children, drank lightly alcoholic beverages as their daily source of hydration. The medieval day began not with water, but with ale. But this didn't mean medieval people loved what they drank. Many saw it as a compromise. Water was ideal in theory. It was clean, cheap, and religiously virtuous. Monks wrote about the purity of spring water in their cloisters. Saints were said to perform miracles by drawing clear water from rocks. But, in practice, even the most pious often opted for ale, not out of preference, but out of necessity. In urban centers, the problem was acute. Medieval cities were not built with sanitation in mind. Waste was dumped into open gutters, which drained into nearby rivers or seeped into wells. Animals shared the street spigots. Chickens, horses, and their waste did too. Public bathhouses, once a symbol of hygiene, gradually fell out of favor during plague years, and suspicion of standing water grew. A man might draw water from a well only to discover it had been contaminated by a nearby tannery or butcher shop. And so wine and ale rose in esteem not because they were pure, but because they were predictably impure. A bad cask might make you gag. A bad cup of water might kill you. Wine, especially in the Mediterranean, played a different role. In regions like southern France, Italy, and Spain, wine was more readily available than ale. It was consumed daily, often diluted. Roman traditions of mixing water with wine continued well into the Middle Ages. To drink wine neat was considered indulgent or even vulgrant, lest you were at a feast. In monasteries, wine was doled out in precise rations, 1 cup per monk per day, though that cup could be large and flexible depending on the abbot's mood. In Northern Europe, in households, monasteries, and eventually commercial operations, ale varied wildly in strength and quality. Some batches were thin and sour, barely stronger than broth. By seasons, moon phases, and family traditions. And because ale spoiled quickly, it had to be made and consumed constantly. A family might brew every other day just to keep up. But wine and ale weren't always safe. They could go bad, be adulterated, or misused. Unscrupulous tavern keepers might water down wine or stretch ale with stale grain. Some even added herbs or chalk to disguise spoilage. Laws were passed in towns across Europe to regulate drink quality, appointing altisters and wine gaugers. These men local officials, not necessarily trained in anything beyond taste and loyalty, would patrol taverns, sampling drinks, checking measurements, and levying fines. Still, enforcement was inconsistent and complaints abounded. There were also fears, sometimes rational, sometimes not, that drink itself could spread disease. During plague outbreaks, suspicion turned on taverns and winehouses, not because of their drink alone, but because they gathered people in close quarters. Some believed spoiled wine could carry illness. Ales to drive out plague humors. Physicians of the unequal parts, learned and speculative, sometimes advised patients to avoid cold water entirely, blaming it for everything from stomach cramps to divine punishment. Yet, despite all this, people still sought out water. In villages with access to clean springs or fast-moving brooks, residents continued to use it for cooking, cleaning, and sometimes drinking, especially if blessed by local clergy. Be drawn straight from the source. But even then, people hedged their bets. Travelers, for instance, often carried wine flasks, not out of wealth, but caution. You never knew what the next well might hold. And then there was rainwater, collected in barrels, basins, or stone cisterns. It was a wild card, clean in theory, but easily contaminated in practice. A bird's nest on the roof, a dead rodent in the gutteret. Didn't take much to turn a rain barrel into a brew of illness. Some households boiled it, others blessed it. Most just drank it and hoped. So what did it feel like to live in a world where every sip could be a gamble? Where trust was placed in a mug of weak ale rather than the village? Well, and how did people pass that caution on through recipes, superstitions, or quiet, unspoken rules of what not to drink? In a world where clean water was more rumor than reality, strategies for safe drinking were as varied as they were improvised. People didn't always understand why water made them sick. They didn't know about microbes or bacteria, but they knew it happened, and so they adapted. Sometimes those adaptations worked, sometimes they didn't. But from royal courts to peasant huts, everyone drank with a mix of necessity, ritual, and quiet suspicion. One common defense was boiling. While rarely done solely for water consumption, boiling was a routine part of cooking and brewing, and people noticed that water used in soups or teas didn't cause the same stomach ailments. Monks, ever methodical, boiled water for herb infusions and often observed better health outcomes, though they attributed this more to the saintly properties of mint or rosemary than to sterilization. In some regions, a boiled water cure was recommended for those suffering digestive troubles, though it was usually reserved for the sick, not the daily drinker. For most people, though, the better alternative was transformation. Turn the water into something else, anything else. Wine was fermented, ale was brewed, mead was steeped with honey and herbs. These processes didn't just add flavor, they made the drink safer. Brewing required boiling the mash, which killed off many pathogens. Herbs like wormwood, mugwort, and thyme often added more for preservation than taste had mild antimicrobial effects, though no one knew that. In scientific terms, they just knew the ale lasted longer and went down smoother, and so trust was placed in process. If water was risky, then water that had been worked upon, heated, blessed, fermented, flavored, was safer. This is why even children drank ale. In medieval England, often a weak version called small beer brewed from the second or third run of the mash. It was cloudy, yeasty, barely alcoholic, and filled with nutrients. Babies were sometimes weaned onto it. Monks brewed it in bulk. Hospitals served it to the sick. No one would mistake it for fine drink, but it kept people alive. The church, too, played a role in shaping drinking habits. Clergy were deeply involved in wine production, especially in southern Europe, where vineyards were often owned or managed by monasteries. Wine was sacred, after all. It was used in the Mass, tied to the blood of Christ, and central to Christian ritual. But even outside of church ceremonies, wine held religious weight. Pilgrims drank it at holy sites. Priests blessed it before meals. Some believed that wine from a saint's vineyard could cure illness or ward off demons. This sacred association gave wine a level of cultural trust that water could never quite match. But the blessing extended to water, too, at least in special cases. Holy wells dotted the landscape, often tied to saints or miraculous legends. These were considered safe to drink from, even healing. Pilgrims traveled miles to collect vials of sacred water believed to cure ailments, restore fertility, or protect against the plague. In Ireland, the cult of holy wells was particularly strong, with certain springs considered potent enough to treat blindness or mental illness. Yet even here, people were cautious. They might drink only a few sips and pour the rest over afflicted body parts. In many places, they drank only after a prayer or offering. Among the elite, trust was shaped not just by faith, but by access. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk had servants to filter, flavor, and fetch their water. Charcoal filtering was used in some households. Pitchers lined with silver or copper, believed to have purifying properties, were popular among those who could afford them. Wine was preferred at court, often imported, diluted, and served with ceremony. Royal physicians frequently prescribed spiced wine for everything from melancholy to gout. Mulled wine, heated and steeped with cloves or cinnamon, was thought to balance the humors. Interestingly, the distrust of water also extended to certain public fountains. While many towns invested in aqueducts or communal water sources, not all fountains were viewed equally. Some were reserved for laundry, others for livestock. And even when a fountain was technically safe, local gossip might deem it otherwise. People believed wells could be cursed or fouled by witches, enemies, or sinful behavior. If someone fell sick, it wasn't the bacteria no one could sit, was likely the old widow who had glared at the bucket last Thursday. Urban authorities, for their part, tried to keep the peace and the pipes. In cities like Paris, Florence, and London, officials hired water wardens to inspect wells and fountains. They posted warnings against dumping waste too close to streams and fined those caught washing offal or slaughtering animals near water sources. But enforcement was weak, and infrastructure was fragile. One cracked pipe or backed-up gutter could turn a clean street into a sewer overnight, so people adapted with folk knowledge. They learned which wells to avoid in spring, which taverns had a reputation for stretching their ale, which rivers tasted better upstream. They flavored bad water with vinegar, fruit, or herbs. They developed unspoken habits about who got the first cup from the bucket and who drank last, and when they couldn't be sure, they drank ale. This created a paradox. Water was supposed to be the essence of life, but wine and beer were what people trusted, and trust was everything more than taste, cost, or convenience. To drink was to believe in the person who brewed it, the place it came from, and the process that made it safe. When that trust broke, when someone got sick or died, it wasn't seen as chance. It was seen as betrayal. But how did this long-standing mistrust of water shape urban design, public health, and even the very layout of medieval homes? And how did communities slowly, stubbornly start to reclaim the cup of water as something drinkable again? If distrust shaped the medieval relationship with water, then necessity drove its quiet, cautious redemption. You couldn't avoid water forever. It was still needed for cooking, cleaning, brewing, and bathing, however infrequent those baths may have been. And gradually, as populations swelled and towns grew, people began to reimagine their relationship with water. not through sudden enlightenment, but through a slow patchwork of adaptation, architecture, and surprisingly effective guesswork. Cities began to invest modestly, imperfectly, but deliberately infrastructure. In 13th century London, the great conduit system was constructed to channel clean spring water into the city center. Stone-lined channels and lead pipes carried water from outside the city walls, reducing the need to rely on wells polluted by overcrowding and runoff. Other towns followed suit: Bruges, Prague, Paris, Florence, each developing rudimentary water management systems that, while limited, acknowledged that water could be trusted again if carefully controlled. Still, the systems were far from foolproof. Lead pipes, wooden gutters, cracked cisterns, and corruption among maintenance officials often rendered improvements only partially effective, but they represented a turning point. Municipalities began to take responsibility, however inconsistently, for what flowed from tap or fountain. Some towns posted notices near public wells with dates of cleaning. Others banned industries like tanners and dyers from operating upstream of drinking fountains. A new kind of civic pride emerged, not just in cathedrals or marketplaces, but in who had the cleanest fountain or the coolest spring. Private households adapted to in larger homes, especially among the merchant class. Rainwater was increasingly collected and filtered through sand or charcoal. Ceramic jars were designed with narrow necks to keep out dust and pests. Lids were tied down with cloth soaked in vinegar. Servants were trained to let the first drawing from a well go to waste, assuming that whatever sat in the pipe overnight was best poured onto the garden. In monasteries and universities, water was handled with even greater care. Monastic orders, like the Cistercians, known for their practical engineering, created sophisticated systems of canals and aqueducts to direct clean water toward their cloisters. They used gravity-fed plumbing, latrines flushed by streams, and separate systems for washing and drinking. Their attention to detail had less to do with science and more with cleanliness, being next to godliness, but the result was often cleaner water than found in the surrounding town. Even ordinary peasants were not passive in this process. Oral traditions passed down knowledge about where to dig a safe well, how to line it with stone, and which trees suggested good groundwater nearby. Some villages designated a particular spring keeper or well watcher whose job was to maintain cleanliness, not an official post, but a respected one. In alpine and forested regions, where natural springs were more abundant, entire communities revolved around known sources of safe water, building shrines or markers at especially dependable locations. Yet, the redemption of water was not complete. Trust came slowly and often conditionally. Water remained suspect during times of crisis, especially plague years, when the Black Death returned again and again in the 14th and 15th centuries. Water, like air, became a source of dread. People avoided public fountains, bathhouses were closed. Physicians returned to recommending spiced wine and boiled beer. During these years, the wine barrel reclaimed its place as Europe's most trusted vessel, and there were still places, particularly in densely populated cities, where people lived entire lives without ever trusting a cup of water. Slum dwellers, beggars, and migrant workers often had no access to wells or rain barrels, and instead relied on the cheapest tavern ale or shared from contaminated gutters. Disease flourished not only from contact, but from class. The poor drank what they could. The rich drank what they chose. In this way, water became a marker of privilege, not just access, but confidence. But over time, the story shifted. New ideas arrived. Renaissance humanism brought renewed interest in ancient Roman plumbing and hydraulic engineering. Books circulated with diagrams of cisterns and drainage systems. Public health, not yet scientific, but increasingly civic, became a topic of discussion. Urban reformers called for cleaner streets, regulated waste disposal, and protected water supplies. By the 16th century, cities like Augsburg and Milan were experimenting with layered filtration systems. In London, aqueducts were extended, fountains were improved, and perhaps most importantly, people began writing about water not just as a risk, but as a resource to be protected. Clean water became a point of pride. Towns competed not only in trade and beauty, but in the quality of what bubbled from their fountains. Yet, culturally, the memory lingered. Even as water grew safer, ale and wine remained default drinks at many tables, not out of necessity, but out of habit. And stories from just a generation or two before, of sickened neighbors, of bad wells, of a plague traced back to a communal bucket, kept the memory of danger fresh. Grandparents warned children, priests reminded their flocks, and the quiet tradition of mistrust passed on. So what can we learn from a world that lived so long in fear of its most essential element? Perhaps that trust, once broken, takes generations to rebuild. That safety, even when possible, must still be earned. And that, in the medieval world, nothing was as simple as a glass of water. To drink, in medieval Europe, was ordinary. To overdrink, however, that was dangerous, and not just for your health. In the eyes of the church, too much wine or ale didn't just swell the belly or slow the speech, it imperiled the soul. Drunkenness, that most socially visible of vices, was a favorite target for preachers, chroniclers, reformers, and moralists alike. Not because alcohol was forbidden. In fact, the church was among Europe's largest producers of wine and beer, but because the line between drinking and sinning was perilously thin, and the fall from grace could be poured straight into a cup. From cathedral pulpits and roadside shrines, the message was clear. Moderation was holy, excess was hellish. Drunkenness wasn't simply frowned upon, it was classified as a sin of the flesh, nestled alongside gluttony, lust, and sloth in the theological taxonomy of wrongdoing. The famous 7 deadly sins, codified by the early church fathers and later popularized through medieval sermons and art, often depicted the drunkard not as a figure of amusement, but of decay, bloated, red-faced, collapsing on the road to damnation. And yet, the relationship between Christianity and alcohol was complicated. Wine was central to the most sacred ritual in Christendom, the Eucharist. At every Mass, priests transformed wine into the blood of Christ. Monasteries cultivated vineyards and brewed ale, often selling it to the laity. Bishops held feasts. Saints were offered wine on feast days. In many religious communities, moderate drinking was part of daily life. So how did the same substance become both sacred and sinful? The answer lies in intent and excess. The Church's moral focus wasn't on the drink itself, but on what it revealed about the soul. A man who drank to warm himself during winter, or to celebrate harvest with his neighbors, might be commended. A man who drank to escape duty, to brawl, or to indulge in pleasure without measure, he was courting spiritual disaster. It wasn't what filled the cup, but how quickly and how greedily it was emptied. Preachers in the 12th and 13th centuries seized upon this distinction with gusto. Collections of sermons, such as those by the popular preacher Jacques de Vitry, are full of scathing attacks on drunkards. They describe men who stagger from tavern to tavern, cursing, vomiting, forgetting their prayers. Some sermons liken the drunkard to a pig, a beast so sunk in pleasure that it forgets its own dignity. Others tell tales of divine punishment. A man who drank himself into unconsciousness and awoke paralyzed. Another who died in the street and whose corpse could not be buried in consecrated ground. Visual art reinforced the point. In many illustrated manuscripts, the vice of drunkenness was depicted with grotesque humor figures, with distorted features, tumbling from chairs or being dragged by devils into flaming pits. In stained glass and fresco, the image of the drunkard appeared near those of thieves and adulterers, a public warning in the most literal sense. These illustrations weren't just decoration, they were theology for the illiterate. If you couldn't read Latin, you could still understand that drinking too much could land you in very hot water, but sermons and glasswork weren't the only deterrents. The Church also issued real-world consequences. Repeat drunkards, especially those who caused scandal or violence, could be denied communion. In extreme cases, they might be excommunicated. Ecclesiastical courts, separate from secular ones, often handled such offenses. A monk who drank to excess might face penance, fasting, whipping, or weeks of silence. A layperson might be ordered to publicly confess, pay a fine, or walk barefoot to a shrine. These penalties weren't about punishment alone, they were about restoring order, both in the soul and in the community. Even confession manuals books that guided priests in determining penance contained specific questions about drink. Had the penitent drunk to the point of forgetting prayers? Had they encouraged others to drink sinfully? Had they committed other sins while drunk? Violence, fornication, blasphemy. Drunkenness was rarely a solitary vice. It opened the door to others, making it all the more dangerous. Yet for all this moral strictness, the Church never sought to eliminate alcohol. In fact, some of the finest wine in Europe came from ecclesiastical lands. Monasteries in Burgundy, the Rhineland, and the Loire Valley were celebrated for their vintages. Monks took pride in their brewing, recording precise methods for fermentation and storage. In England and the Low Countries, abbeys were major producers of ale. Even during Lent, when food and pleasure were restricted, certain monastic rules permitted beer as it was considered liquid bread. This duality wasn't hypocrisy, was theology. The drink was not the sin. The abuse of the drink was, as with so much in medieval thought, virtue lay in balance. The path to holiness was narrow, bordered on one side by starvation, and on the other by indulgence. But what about the tavern keeper, the alewife, the vintner? Were they sinners for providing temptation? Could one be both pious and profitable when selling spirits? And what happened when the Church itself grew wealthy from the very drinks it warned against? The Church in medieval Europe was both judge and brewer, moral guardian and economic player, and this tension played out daily in parishes, taverns, and monastic courtyards. While priests condemned the sins of drunkenness from the pulpit, abbots oversaw the export of wine barrels to noble clients, while confessors warned penitents against alehouse vice. Monasteries brewed, branded, and sold that very ale with quiet efficiency. It was a paradox, too practical to ignore, too profitable to stop. Monasteries, especially, were deeply entwined with the alcohol trade. In the countryside, they were often the largest landholders, owning vineyards, hop fields, barley plots, and entire breweries. They controlled the means of production, the labor, and the routes to market. In France, the Cistercians and Benedictines managed vineyards in Burgundy that would eventually form the backbone of Europe's wine tradition. In Germany, abbeys near the Rhine and Mosel rivers cultivated vines on steep hillsides, their wines, transported in barrels marked with ecclesiastical seals. These weren't fringe operations. They were industrial by medieval standards, well-organized, labor-intensive, and tax-generating. Some abbeys even had their own branded wine and ale jugs, stamped with the symbol of the order. Buyers saw these marks as signs of quality, cleanliness, and even divine blessing. Drinking holy ale wasn't just a treat it felt spiritually safe. It came from the hands of men who prayed daily. How could that possibly lead to sin? The church's answer was, again, in the intent. Selling wine wasn't a sin. Encouraging sin was. A monastery could brew ale, but it was expected to price it fairly, avoid fraud, and refrain from marketing it as an indulgent pleasure. Profit was tolerated so long as it served a higher purpose. Money from drink sales was often funneled into poor relief, construction projects, or pilgrim hospitality. This allowed monks to walk a fine theological line, supplying alcohol while condemning its abuse. But this balance wasn't always observed. Records show repeated complaints against monasteries that overcharged for wine or used their influence to outcompete local lay brewers. In Flanders and parts of England, tensions between townspeople and monastic sellers sometimes flared into legal disputes or quiet retaliation. Accusations flew. The monks watered their ale, hoarded the best hops, bribed inspectors. The monastic orders defended themselves with documentation ledgers, charters, privileges granted by kings or popes, and for the most part, they won. The church's economic power was nearly unchallengeable. Meanwhile, outside monastic walls, taverns and alehouses occupied a different moral category. These were lay spaces, often owned by women, run by families, and serving an unpredictable crowd. The church saw taverns as morally volatile places where moderation vanished and temptation thrived. In many sermon texts, the alehouse is described as the devil's parlor, a place where demons lurk behind barrels and sins stack up like empty mugs. Illustrations showed tavern-goers with glazed eyes and open mouths falling prey to lust, theft, or brawling all while the innkeeper counted coins in the background. Yet the reality was more nuanced. Many taverns hosted religious travelers, local clergy, and even monks traveling between abbeys. Not all were dens of vice. Some taverns paid tithes to the church. Others hosted feast day gatherings or charitable events, but moral suspicion lingered, especially toward those who profited from drink. Tavern keepers, particularly alewives, were often accused not just of overcharging, but of enabling sin. to sell strong drink to a known drunkard was seen by some confessors as a sin of encouragement, a second-hand corruption. This suspicion found expression in canon law and confession manuals. Taverners were asked, did they encourage excess? Did they water their wine? Did they serve drink on Sundays during Mass? Did they allow indecent behavior under their roofs? Confessors were instructed to probe not only the actions of the drinker, but the conscience of the seller. For the Church, complicity was just as damning as indulgence. Despite these warnings, taverns flourished. People needed a place to gather, to talk, to rest, and drink was central to that culture. So, the Church tried to steer rather than forbid. Feasts were moderated. Drinking songs were rewritten with religious lyrics. Special ale known as church ale in England was brewed to fund church repairs and support the poor. These ales were sold at festivals, often on saints' days, in churchyards or village greens. People drank not just for pleasure, but for piety. A portion of every mug supported the parish. Even in condemnation, the Church understood drinks hold on the social order. Priests and bishops might decry overindulgence, but they also knew that taverns calmed the restless, employed the idle, and helped maintain seasonal rhythms. Wine at weddings, ale at harvest, mulled drink at Yule tides were not threats to the soul. They were part of life's ritual. Only when those rituals broke down, when someone drank instead of working, praying, or tending to family, did the moral machinery kick in. And so, the medieval relationship between the Church and drink was neither war nor surrender. It was, in typical medieval fashion, a negotiation, a careful calculus of sin, survival, revenue, and ritual, a balancing act between the belly and the soul. But what happened when drinking became protest? When wine and ale weren't just indulgences, but symbols of resistance, of defiance, even of heresy? How did the cup become not just a personal danger, but a political one? By the late Middle Ages, a curious thing was happening. The same drinks that had once symbolized celebration, hospitality, and holiness were beginning to take on new meanings, some of them rebellious. Ale, wine, and other spirits didn't just soothe the masses anymore. They started speaking for them in taverns and city squares, in the slurred toasts of discontented workers and the private gatherings of dissenting sects. Drink was no longer just a sin to be avoided. It was becoming a signal, a quiet, bubbling protest. It wasn't immediate. For most of medieval history, wine and ale were framed within the Church's language of morality, personal vices, individual temptations, lapses of the flesh. But as tensions grew between Church authorities and the increasingly burdened peasantry, between reformist thinkers and the institutional clergy, even the mug in a man's hand became politically charged. What once was seen as merely indulgent behavior could now be interpreted, depending on context, as seditious. Start with the Lollards. In 14th century England, followers of John Wycliffe, the Lollards rejected many Catholic doctrines, especially the wealth of the Church and the sacramental system. They criticized the Eucharist itself, the idea that wine literally became the blood of Christ, and rejected the exclusivity of the priesthood in offering it. This wasn't just a theological tweak. It was a direct affront to centuries of doctrine, and to the Church's control over sacred drink. In some Lollard gatherings, wine was shared among the people in ways that mimicked the Mass, but rejected its sacramental meaning. They passed cups hand to hand not as vessels of transformation, but as emblems of community. The cup no longer needed the priest. It needed only people and purpose. To the ecclesiastical authorities, this was heresy. To the lollards, it was liberation. Similar tensions brewed elsewhere. In Bohemia, the Hussites' followers of Jan Hus demanded communion in both kinds, meaning that lay people should receive not just the bread but the wine, just as priests did. This demand, known as the Utraquist position, became a flashpoint. The chalice, in their movement, became a symbol of defiance. It appeared on banners, badges, and walls. To raise the cup was no longer just to drink, it was to resist. The church recognized the threat. This was no longer about drunkenness in taverns. It was about who had the right to offer, bless, and drink the sacred liquid. If wine could be democratized without clerical mediation, then what authority remained in the hands of the priesthood? And yet, the irony endured. Even the most radical reformers still used wine and ale. They brewed it, traded it, blessed it. Just as the church once feared the alehouse as a rival pulpit, it now saw the cup itself as a contested altar. This tension trickled down to ordinary people. In city taverns, drink became a way to express discontent not just against landlords or kings, but against bishops and abbots. Songs mocking the clergy circulated in alehouses. Toasts were raised to saints not approved by Rome, or to legendary rebels like Robin Hood. Ballads told of monks with wine-stained robes and priests too fond of their parish's brew. In times of unrest, peasant uprisings, guild revolts, border wars, taverns often became meeting points, not just for conspiracy, but for catharsis. The act of drinking together built solidarity. It bound rebels. It allowed coded speech and rehearsed chants. In some uprisings, like the English Rising of 1381 or the German Peasants' War of 1524–25, insurgents used drink both as morale and as message. To drink against the tithe or to the poor man's law was to declare allegiance. Even outside rebellion, the very act of feasting could be political. The church placed strict limits on celebration, fast days, food rules, Lenten abstinence, but taverns often ignored them. To drink meat broth on a Friday or toast with ale during Advent was not merely indulgent, it was resistance by appetite, a slow, stubborn erosion of ecclesiastical control through the everyday pleasures of the cup. By the time of the Reformation, the tension snapped. Martin Luther himself was famously fond of beer. He celebrated it as a gift from God and used it as a symbol of earthy, practical faith, in contrast to what he saw as the sterile ritualism of Rome. In taverns across Germany, Lutheran tracts were read aloud over pamphlets mocked the Pope and praised the printing press, the pulpit, and the public house, and still the church warned. Still it preached moderation, issued penance, and reminded believers that the devil crouched in the dregs of every unmeasured pour. But by now, the cup was not just a temptation, it was a weapon. And once that line had been crossed, wine and ale had become tools of both protest and reform. The church could no longer control the narrative. So where does that leave us? Perhaps it shows that control over behavior, especially something as universal as drink, can only go so far. You can regulate, condemn, even punish, but the cup, once lifted, can be filled with more than ale. It can hold belonging, memory, rebellion, and if history teaches anything, it's that people will always drink not just for pleasure, but for meaning. Medieval kings did many things in excess: hunting, feasting, taxing, marrying cousins, but few indulgences matched the performative spectacle of royal drinking. A king's cup wasn't just a vessel, it was a symbol. What, when, and how he drank reflected everything from power and wealth to divine favor. Behind every goblet of jeweled silver, every ceremonial pour into a golden basin, lay centuries of custom, expectation, and, sometimes, a dangerously foggy morning after dot in the popular imagination. Medieval royal banquets were an endless swirl of roast peacock, lute music, and barrels of wine tipped straight into noble gullets. And to be fair, that picture isn't entirely wrong. Feasts were long, loud, and lubricated. Wine flowed freely, especially for crowned heads and their honored guests. But not all royal drinking was about indulgence. Much of it was performance, a carefully choreographed display of rank, ritual, and diplomacy, where the drink served as both prop and punctuation. The royal drinking cup, for instance, was often a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It could be made from gold, silver, ivory, or even coconut shell, mounted in precious metals, each choice sending a message. Jewels glittered not for beauty alone, but to reflect divine favor and earthly might. The cup was passed ceremonially, raised high before the first sip, sometimes blessed, sometimes tested for poison. When a king drank, the court watched, and the watching mattered. In medieval courts, the king's health was political currency. To see him drink heartily was a sign of strength. To see him abstain too often might spark rumors of illness or divine dis. At coronations and weddings, a monarch's ability to keep pace cup for cup with his nobles was more than festive cheer. It was a demonstration of virility, fortitude, and trustworthiness. A king who could outdrink his barons might well outlast their rebellions. Of course, kings rarely drank alone. Feasts were social and strategic tools, filled with guests whose placement, food, and drink were assigned with tactical care. The loving cup, a shared vessel passed among honored diners, was a common feature of such events. Drinking from it wasn't just a gesture of friendship. It was a public affirmation of loyalty and mutual dependence. Refusing the cup, or failing to lift it with the appropriate ceremony, default drink of royalty, especially in southern and central Europe. Red or white, imported or local, it arrived in casks, amphorae, and skin bladders, then filtered, spiced, or diluted before being served. Medieval palates often preferred sweet, heavily flavored wines steeped in cinnamon, ginger, or honey. These weren't just for taste. Clove or nutmeg-infused wine might also be offered as a luxury item to high-ranking guests, underscoring the host's wealth and access to costly imports from the East in Northern Europe. Mead still made strong appearances at royal tables, particularly during winter or rural feasts. These were often of the highest quality, brewed in monastic or royal cellars, aged in carefully maintained barrels. Mead fermented honey drink was favored for its sweetness and association with ancient heroism and long-dead kings. To sip mead from a horn in a high hall was to step into legend, if only for a night. Yet, with all this drink came danger. Chroniclers occasionally recorded royal overindulgence When Edward the Fourth of England was said to have drunk too much at a feast, the tone was often more admiring than critical. A merry king, after all, was preferable to a dear one. Of the pheasant in 1450 for an opulent banquet, intended to inspire a new crusade, the wine flowed for hours. Guests toasted saints, kings, ancestors, and even the Ottoman Sultan in ironic jest. The king's ability to remain upright, coherent. Session ended with laughter. Richard II of England, known for his elaborate court manners, often abstained or drank with visible restraint, fueling speculation about his aloofness and disconnection from his nobility. His eventual downfall was due to politics, not sobriety, but the image lingered. By contrast, Charles VI of France, who suffered from bouts of madness, was sometimes rumored to have worsened his condition with wine. Whether true or not, the association between drink and instability clung to his reign like sour lees. Foreign guests, too, brought their own drinking customs and expectations. When Eastern envoys arrived in Western courts, they might refuse alcohol altogether. This was tolerated, but noted. Spiced aquavits or honey liquorzit was often received as exotic delight or terrifying challenge. Cultural clashes over drink were not uncommon. One ambassador's polite sip could be another's insult. Etiquette manuals from the 15th century began including guidance for such situations: how much to drink, when to pretend to sip, when to pass the cup with honor rather than lips, and always, there was the risk of overindulgence. Kings were human. Some drank to impress, others to escape. Feasts were long, and pressure was high. High seat. These moments were rarely forgotten, especially by enemies. So, what happened when the drink went too far? When royal dignity dissolved in the dregs of a jeweled cup? And how did kings recover or fall from hangovers seen by half the court? A king's misstep was never entirely his own. In medieval Europe, the monarch was not just a man, he was a symbol. His strength was the realm's strength, his restraint the mirror of divine order, his composure a sign of celestial favor. So, when a king drank too deeply, when his voice slurred or his body slumped, the consequences rippled far beyond the high table. The cup might be small, but its fallout could span nations. One of the most enduring themes in late medieval chronicling is the precarious balance between regal indulgence and royal disgrace. Chroniclers rarely wrote openly of a king's drunkenness unless it served a political narrative, but when they did, whether with a smirk or a sermon, the implication was serious. A king who couldn't hold his drink might not be able to hold his crown. Take the example of Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. Became legendary, even in his own lifetime. Known for his lavish court and erratic behavior, Wenceslas often skipped council meetings or held them in wine-soaked gardens. One famous tale describes him abandoning court proceedings to go hawking wine cup still in hand. His inability to maintain dignity while drinking wasn't just a personal flaw. It became fodder for political enemies who painted him as unstable, unfit, and a danger to the realm. Love of drink as part of their justification. And yet, kings didn't always fall from grace for their drinking. Sometimes they fell into myth and lead a decisive charge in battle. Whether or not it's true doesn't matter. The tale lived on because it fit a model of the merry monarch, a man who drank heartily, yet ruled with vigor. In this framing, drink enhanced the legend. But not all kings were so lucky. In the case of Charles II of Navarre, nicknamed Charles, the bad wine mixed with politics, plots, and poison. His court, riddled with factionalism and distrust, often turned banquets into battlegrounds of subtle offense. Drinking first or refusing was loaded with implication. Eventually, Charles himself died a horrible death, not from drink directly, but from being wrapped in alcohol-soaked bandages that caught fire. The image of a ruler literally consumed by strong drink was irresistible to moralists of the age. Even well-loved monarchs could suffer from the excesses of court drinking culture. Banquets were sprawling affairs, often lasting for hours or days. Be mistaken for weakness. Court etiquette required a king to seem engaged without becoming ensnared. Servants were trained to dilute the king's wine or substitute water if he allowed it. Toasts that required participation, coronation feasts, diplomatic visits, and treaty celebrations all demanded public, performative drinking. Cups, drinking in turn, toasting saints, ancestors, or even enemies in symbolic peace. A misstepped, drinking out of order, failing to toast back, or appearing unwell could be seen as more than impolite. It could be taken as political weakness. Some kings, aware of these risks, trained for it. It's not as absurd as it sounds. Knowing one's limit, spacing drinks, or feigning deeper intoxication than truly felt were skills. There were even courtiers, particularly stewards and food tasters, who signaled to the king how strong a particular wine was, how to pace the meal, or when to retire without seeming abrupt. Entire roles developed around managing the royal relationship with the cup. Some kings were mocked for sluggishness at council the day after a feast. King who wakes with the wrong ink on his treaties, or whose head is more beryl than crown. And yet, perhaps the most telling detail was how kings used drink themselves. Offering wine to a rival was a gesture of peace or of danger. Some kings were known to test guests' limits, using overdrinking as a way to coax secrets or assess honesty. Others orchestrated wine traps, luring nobles into loose tongues and then punishing them later for their candor. So while drink was joy and ritual, it was also strategy, which leaves us with the paradox. The king's cup was always full, but never simple. It was a tool, a stage, and a test. To drink too little was coldness, too much madness. To lift the cup was to be watched, and to drop it, even once, might echo for years. But what about queens and royal women? Did they drink as freely? Were they subject to the same expectations, or bound by a different set of fears entirely? If the drinking habits of kings were spectacles measured, watched, whispered about, then the drinking of queens was something far more delicate. A quiet performance within a gilded cage. In a world where royal men were expected to raise their cups in boisterous displays of strength and camaraderie, royal women had to navigate their own relationship with alcohol with far more subtlety. The cup in a queen's hand was never just a drink, it was a statement of propriety, class, fertility, diplomacy, and above all, restraint. At most court feasts, women, especially high-born women, were expected to be present, beautiful, and dignified. They could sip, but not gulp, toast, but not initiate, smile, but not slur. Drinking was permitted, yes, but rarely in the same quantities, or with the same freedom afforded to men. A queen drunk in public, that was scandal. A queen avoiding wine entirely, suspicion. Her relationship with the cup was judged not by how much she consumed, but by how well she maintained her mask. Yet many royal women did drinks, sometimes heavily, though rarely in view. Wines flavored with herbs or honey were often prescribed to noblewomen for ailments ranging from headaches to fertility concerns. Hippocras, a sweetened, spiced wine thought to warm the womb, was common at banquets and in royal chambers. Mulled wine was given to queens during childbirth, both to steady nerves and to symbolize comfort. In this way, alcohol took on an almost medicinal role, justified when wrapped in care or ritual, even as it remained fraught. Some queens used drinking to reinforce their image. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose reputation was equal parts political genius and courtly icon, presided over feasts where wine was abundant and refinement was expected. Her court at Poitiers became legendary for its poetry, wit, and grace, including the subtle management of dining etiquette. With the right gesture, at the right moment, was not just elegance. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, presided over a fractured English court, where politics often unfolded in tense banquet halls. Her strength was wielded through strategic alliances, not merriment, and her drinking, if any, was cautious. Any hint of excess would have been seized upon by enemies already eager to paint her as foreign, haughty, or suspect. In fact, for many, queens abstaining from drink or drinking only lightly became part of a broader strategy to avoid rumors and distance themselves from the misbehavior of their male counterparts. But court gossip had a long reach. Isabella of Bavaria, Queen of France in the late 14th century, was accused, not always fairly, of vanity, extravagance, and loving the goblet too much. Chroniclers, who disliked her politics, described her as wasteful and loose-lipped at feasts, whether or not that reflected reality. In her case, the accusations weren't just about alcohol, they were about power, space to enjoy alcohol without condemnation. Dowagers, especially, had more freedom. Find references to gift bottles, personal wine cellars, and sweet wines sent for comfort during illness or mourning. These women were no longer symbols of the nation's future. They were its memory, and their drinking could be framed as dignified indulgence at banquets. Floral patterns, or adorned with enamel, it might contain hippocras, mead, or light white wine, rather than the dark, heady reds preferred by male drinkers. Servants poured carefully, and often poured less. There was no drunken queen stumbling from the dais, not publicly, but there were queens who drank behind tapestries, in quiet chambers. The hard spirits emerging in Eastern Europe, these were viewed as masculine domains, places of toasting, boasting, and eventual brawling. Queens were not supposed to take part in when they did, it was noticed. Yet alcohol could still become part of their legacy. Catherine de' Medici, while not a heavy drinker herself, is credited with popularizing certain liqueurs and wine-based cordials in the French court. Her kitchens and apothecaries were famed for their innovations, many of which involved alcohol infused with herbs. In her world, drink wasn't excess, and it left a legacy far different from the image of a king staggering down the hall. So while kings might wake with pounding heads and laughing courtiers, queens walked a narrower path. Their cups were smaller, their sips fewer, but no less meaningful. In a world that watched their every move, even the decision to lift the gobletor not carried political weight, and when they did truly drink it, was rarely for show. It was for privacy, relief, mourning, or quiet defiance. In the stillness of the medieval monastery, solitude and rigorous spiritual discipline. And often that was true. But behind those heavy wooden doors and cloistered gardens, something else was brewing literally. For while monks renounced many earthly pleasures, beer was not one of them. In an age when water could kill and nourishment was unpredictable, beer became a staple of religious life. It was food, drink, medicine, and income all at once. And in the hands of monks, brewing became a craft of almost sacred precision, guided by the rule of Saint Benedict, the rhythms of liturgy, and the patient trial and of centuries. The idea of monks brewing might seem contradictory. Weren't they supposed to reject worldly indulgence? But the distinction was clear in their minds. Beer or cerevisia wasn't a luxury, it was sustenance. Throughout Europe, advised moderation in all things. It did not forbid alcohol. In fact, it allowed each monk a hemina of wine a day, roughly half a liter and less. Local conditions made that unwise. In colder regions, wine was scarce, so beer took its place. And what beer it was! Early monastic beer was unfiltered, thick, and low in alcohol, more porridge than pint. It was brewed not to intoxicate, but to nourish. Known as liquid bread, filled the stomach and supported fasting routines. During Lent, when food was restricted, monks consumed richer, denser beer to maintain their strength. Over time, they began experimenting, improving recipes, refining grain selection, adjusting fermentation, even developing early sanitation techniques. By the 12th century, some monastic breweries rivaled small industries in their complexity and output. Abbeys like St. Gall in Switzerland, Weihenstephan in Bavaria, and St. Sixtus in Flanders weren't just religious centers, they were brewing dynamos. They tracked grain stores, built dedicated brew houses, and kept brewing logs with remarkable detail. Some even had full-time brewmasters, monks, whose entire vocation was making better beer. These weren't backroom experiments. The floors. Monks also pioneered the use of hopswell before hops became standard. While earlier beer was flavored with grut, a mix of herbs like yarrow, monastic brewers began planting hop gardens within their walls and recording their growth. While much of the beer was consumed by the monks themselves, excess stock became an essential tool of charity and commerce. Guest houses attached to abbeys offered travelers a mug of ale and a safe bed, part of their spiritual duty of hospitality. Villagers sometimes received beer as alms, and over time monasteries began selling to the public, creating some of the first regulated, branded beer in Europe. With brewing came profit, and with profit came rules. Church councils occasionally voiced concern about monks becoming too entangled in worldly business. Some abbots were warned against selling too aggressively or pricing too high. Fall into drunkenness or greed, the suds could flow. Still, not every cloister was dry in conscience. There were slips. Some monastic chronicles hint delicately at excessive drinking, fasting, silence, and extra labor were common penances. But most monks knew their limits. Beer was a tool, not a temptation. Interestingly, the brewing process itself mirrored the monastic mindset. It required patience, repetition, and attention to subtle details. From the soaking of the malt to the slow, silent fermentation in oak barrels, brewing fit seamlessly into a life ruled by ritual. The yeast awoke. It was a sacred rhythm, a liquid liturgy. Over centuries, monasteries became known not only for piety, but for flavor. Pilgrims sought out abbey ales, nobles placed orders. Some kings even granted tax exemptions to monastic brewers in exchange for annual deliveries. By the late Middle Ages, Trappist and Benedictine beers had become famous for their strength and clarity. Their names appeared in estate records, their logos on clay jugs and barrel heads. But as brewing became more widespread and more profitable, competition grew. Lay brewers formed guilds. Urban breweries emerged, employing dozens of workers and producing on larger scales. And with every jug sold by a monk, there was a guildsman watching and worrying. So what happened when monastic brewing collided with secular industry? How did the quiet art of cloistered beer provoke noisy disputes in market squares and council halls? By the 13th and 14th centuries, the beer brewed in cloisters wasn't just keeping monks warm during winter fast. It was turning heads and causing headaches in towns across Europe. Monasteries, once content to drink and distribute beer in the name of sustenance and charity, had become serious competitors in the regional beverage economy. And that, for the emerging guilds of secular brewers, was a problem they could no longer ignore. The issue wasn't the quality. Everyone agreed monastic beer was good, sometimes too good, made with cleaner water, better grain, and careful attention to process. It often outshone the rougher, quickly brewed ales of urban taverns. But it wasn't just the taste that drew complaints. It was the tax exemptions, land privileges, and vast networks of labor available to monasteries, where city brewers paid fees for every sack of grain or barrel of ale sold. Monasteries often brewed tax-free, where secular brewers rented cramped buildings. Monks had acres of walled land and access to their own mills and wells. These advantages made for uneven competition. In cities like Ghent, Cologne, and Canterbury, records show bursts of friction, complaints filed, protests held, and laws debated. Secular brewers demanded limits on how much beer monasteries could sell beyond their own cloister. They petitioned town councils to forbid direct sales to taverns. In some places, they tried to impose guild membership on monks who brewed professionally, a strange notion, given that monks answered to abbots, not aldermen. Monasteries pushed back, citing charters granted by kings or popes that confirmed their right to brew and sell. They argued that profits supported the poor, funded hospitals, or built bridges and churches. Sometimes they won, other times they had to scale back. In a few regions, uneasy compromises were reached. Monks could brew for themselves and for pilgrims, but not for open market sale. In others, they were simply too powerful to challenge. Meanwhile, the buyer itself was evolving. With competition came innovation. Monastic brewers, eager to maintain their reputation and revenue, began refining their techniques. Fermentation vessels were improved. yeast handling became more consistent. Some monasteries even began branding their beers with names, seals, and emblems, early versions of what we'd now call labels. Clay jugs stamped with the insignia of a particular abbey became familiar in nearby markets. It wasn't all economic. The beer itself took on a theological weight. Monastic brewers began writing about their methods, not just in practical manuals, but in terms of morality and creation. Brewing was an act of order imposed on chaos, a transformation of simple ingredients into something life-giving. A good brew, like a good prayer, required discipline, humility, and attentiveness. Some monks saw the fermentation process as a metaphor for the soul's conversion grain, broken and boiled, rising anew with the breath of God. But not everyone found this comforting. As the Reformation loomed, critics of monastic wealth and corruption increasingly targeted abbey breweries as symbols of misplaced priorities. Why, they asked, were men who vowed poverty trading in barrels and coin? Why were houses of silence so loud in the beer trade? Figures like Martin Luther himself, a former monk, walked a strange line. Luther appreciated good beer and even praised certain brews from German monasteries, but he also denounced what he saw as clerical hypocrisy. Monks clinging to earthly profits under the guise of holiness. After the Reformation began sweeping through northern Europe, many monasteries were closed, looted, or repurposed. Their breweries often went with them in England. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, 1536 to 1541, led to the shuttering of hundreds of religious houses. Their brewing equipment was auctioned off, their hop gardens left to tangle. Some monastic recipes were adopted by private brewers, others vanished altogether. What had once been sacred labor turned into commercial memory, yet not all was lost in southern Germany and the Low Countries. Some monasteries survived or returned. Centuries later, Trappist orders, in particular, revived the monastic brewing tradition in the 17th and 18th centuries, rebuilding both their cloisters and their copper kettles. Today, their legacy endures. A handful of abbeys like Westflatiron, Chimay, and Orvelstill brew beer according to ancient methods, under strict guidelines. The profits go to charity. The beer is consumed in silence. The cycle continues, but the story of monks and beer isn't just a quaint tale of pastoral devotion. It's a window into how faith, survival, craft, and commerce collide. In the medieval world, where sin was counted in drops and virtue in casks, the monastic brewery was a strange kind of altar, one where prayer met practice, and the line between sacred and secular foamed over with every pour. And yet, one might still wonder, how did the common people view monastic beer? Was it trusted, envied, resented, or was it simply the best thing they could hope to drink? While monks refined their recipes behind cloistered walls, perfecting fermentation in sanctified silence, the world beyond those stone gates was sloshing its way through a very different relationship with beer. To the common people, peasants, pilgrims, traveling merchants, monastic beer was many things: a blessing, a bargain, a mystery, and occasionally a mild irritation. But above all, it was trusted in a time when cleanliness was inconsistent and contamination a daily threat. Monastic beer had a unique reputation for safety. Brewed under watchful eyes, in orderly, well-maintained brewhouses, it was more reliable than the makeshift ales sometimes produced in smoky backrooms or roadside hovels. It tasted better, lasted longer, and didn't have the unpleasant surprise of turning sour by the second mug. People didn't need to understand the exact methods, most didn't. They simply knew that the brothers' beer rarely gave you stomach rot. Pilgrims, in particular, sought it out. As they trudged across medieval Europe on long journeys to Rome, Santiago, or Canterbury, weary travelers knew they could find both shelter and a decent drink at monastic guest houses. The ale served there was often reserved for wayfarers and the poor, thinner than the monk's own supply, but still better than what many could brew themselves. The idea of receiving hospitality in the form of a warm mug of beer, poured by a silent brother beneath a painted archway, carried spiritual comfort along with physical relief. Yet this popularity wasn't without its consequences. Monastic beer, thanks to its quality and volume, quickly developed loyal customer bases even beyond the pilgrims. Local townsfolk would make excuses to visit abbeys. Landowners arranged deliveries. Some monasteries opened taverns just outside their gates, run by lay brothers, where the public could enjoy abbey beer without violating cloister rules. These taverns thrived. They became unofficial community hubs, quiet rivals to urban drinking houses. Too many townspeople. This seemed like divine convenience. You got a superior product, and the profit went to monks who tended the sick and prayed for the dead. But to urban alewives and secular brewers, it felt like cheating. How could one compete with men who paid no taxes, owned vast fields of barley, and claimed heavenly favor on their product labels? In cities where competition was fierce, monastic breweries faced resentment. Whisper campaigns arose. Monks watered their beer, hoarded grain, or secretly sold sinful quantities to soldiers and outlaws. Few of these accusations stuck. Most people simply liked the taste too much to stop. But the mystique of monastic beer ran deeper than flavor. It had an aura. In an age of relics and miracle stories, even something as earthy as beer could carry sacred weight. Some believed that a monk's blessing improved the ale's effect, that it soothed the stomach, steadied the nerves, or cleansed the soul. Stories circulated of sick travelers who recovered after sipping from a monk's mug. A few superstitious drinkers even carried clay shards from broken abbey jugs as charms. Monks didn't encourage these tales directly. They were trained to avoid superstition, but they didn't always correct them either. It served the abbey well when its beer was not only good, but good for you, and besides, if belief could make saints from bones, it could make comfort from barley. Yet not all monks embraced the growing fame of their brew. Some abbots worried that the brewery was becoming the real center of monastic life. Records survive of internal complaints. Too many hours in the brewhouse, too much attention paid to flavor, not enough time in prayer. The balance was delicate. A brother who spent more time testing wort than reading psalms might be seen as straying from his vows. Still, the practical need endured. Brewing provided calories, income, and goodwill. Monks couldn't stop brewing any more than they could stop gardening or baking. They simply had to remember their purpose, not to intoxicate the world, but to nourish it. By the dawn of the early modern period, monastic beer had left its mark not just on palates, but on the future of brewing itself. Many techniques that would later Define European beer cold storage. Second fermentation, use of hops. Standard barrel measures were pioneered or preserved by monks. Their beer, once a matter of survival, had become a cultural legacy. Today, bottles labeled Trappist or Abbey-style nod to this past. Their thick glass and wax seals, their Gothic typefaces and Latin phrases, all point to a time when beer was made with prayer and poured with purpose. And while modern brewers may operate with stainless steel and computerized timing, the core lesson remains. Beer, when crafted with care and consumed in moderation, has always been more than a drink. It's a ritual, a rhythm, a recipe passed down by men who once brewed in silence and drank in reverence. So the next time you sip a rich, dark ale with notes of spice and stone fruit, remember, it may have started not in a pub or palace, but in the quiet cell of a monk, lit by candlelight, beneath the hum of hymns and the scent of boiling grain. Long before the industrial brewery and the pub landlord, the ale of medieval Europe was often brewed, sold, and served by women, known as alewives. These women were the unsung laborers behind one of the most vital aspects of daily life: drinkable, nourishing beer. In a world where clean water was uncertain and nutrition was precious, ale was survival land. The women who brewed it were part artisan, part provider, part entrepreneur, and yet, as centuries passed, many of these same women found themselves vilified, pushed out, or accused of something far worse than overcharging a customer. Their cauldrons, their cats, their broomsticks, ordinary tools of the domestic brewer, would become symbols of suspicion, mockery, and, eventually, witchcraft. But before the shadows crept in, there was a time when brewing was women's work and respected work. At that dot in early and high medieval villages, brewing was primarily done at home. Ale wasn't just a beverage, it was a staple of the family diet. It accompanied every meal, watered the fields during breaks, and was even served to children in watered-down form. Households brewed in small batches, often 2 to 3 times a week, with each barrel consumed before it could spoil. Most households had one person responsible for this rhythm of production, and, most of the time, that person was the wife or mother. For many women, brewing started as a chore, but with the rise of local markets and growing populations, a handful of skilled female brewers realized their ale had value beyond the doorstep. They began brewing extra, setting out wooden signs or poles to indicate when fresh ale was for sale. Some placed brooms across the lintel, a symbol that ale was ready and the house open. A few sold at market stalls. Others ran informal taverns out of their kitchens. These weren't witches in pointed hats. They were businesswomen with ladles and vats. Records from 13th and 14th century England show that women dominated the brewing scene. In towns like Chester, York, and Norwich, the majority of registered brewers in local court rolls were women. They paid brewing fines, called assizes, to regulate price and quality, just like men. Some were widows, maintaining income in their husband's absence. Others were wives, supplementing family earnings. A few were single women entirely supporting themselves through beer, and they weren't just tolerated, they were known. Alewives had reputations. Some were praised for strong drink and good humor, others less so. The ale trade was local, personal, and competitive. If your neighbor's brew was better or cheaper, she might gain favor at your expense. Jealousy was inevitable. So were rumors. But for a while, those rumors stayed within the realm of business. Alewives were fined for overcharging, for watering down beer, for selling poor-quality ale. These fines were routine. Few were moral condemnations, just regulatory annoyances. In many ways, these fines confirmed a brewer's legitimacy. Only those making regular sales got fined at all. Still, cracks in the public image began to form. As urban populations swelled and brewing became more lucrative, resentment grew. Ale were making money. They weren't just surviving, they were gaining independence. Some had no need for a husband. Some spoke too boldly. Some challenged men. And in a patriarchal society, that could be enough to spark suspicion. By the late Middle Ages, brewing was gradually shifting from a domestic chore to a commercial enterprise. Men began entering the trade in larger numbers, often through guilds that required membership, capital, and connections. Alewives, many of whom worked alone, informally, or without formal apprenticeships, were slowly excluded. In cities where brewing guilds grew strong, women were locked out of licenses. Male-run brewhouse began to replace the alewife's kitchen, and with that exclusion came caricature. Alewives began appearing in literature and art as comical figures, loud, slovenly, greedy. They were depicted with cats, tall hats, and cauldrons. Their brooms leaned ominously against the door. These were once signs of brewing. Now they were. The visual language of ridicule. Satirical ballads mocked their wicked brew or their sour faces. Church sermons painted them as gossips or gluttons, fueling vice with every pore. Still, they persisted. In smaller villages and rural areas, women continued to brew quietly, practically, stubbornly, not as witches or villains, but as workers. The beer still needed brewing, families still needed feeding, and for now the broomstick still stood for ale, not accusation, but the tide was rising. Guild pressure, church influence, and economic jealousy would soon merge with something darker. The fear of the female body, the suspicion of the independent woman, the myth of the witch in her kitchen. And so one must ask, how did the alewife's cat become the devil's companion? How did her brewpot become a cauldron of sin? By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the image of the independent alewife had begun to sour. What had once been a respected, if modest, profession was slowly being rebranded through satire, suspicion, and eventually superstition. As brewing drifted from the home to the commercial brewhouse, women were left behind, and their tools of trade pots, cats, brooms, herbs, were reinterpreted not as household necessities, but as sinister signs of heresy, greed, and eventually witchcraft.